James McGrath, welcome to the show.
Hi, Alex. Good to be talking to you.
Well, you've written two books about who I think is the most mysterious character of the New Testament. I mean, there are literally characters that we just know less about, uh, but given how important this person is, and given how much people think they kind of know about him, John the Baptist is, in my estimation, the most mysterious person in the New Testament. I've taken an interest in him recently, and I've been asking people, like, so you know John the Baptist? And they go, yeah, of course I know John the Baptist, yeah. Okay, who is he? Well, he's the guy that baptized Jesus. Okay, what does that mean? Like, what is baptism in that time, like before Christianity existed? What was he doing? Oh, well, he prepared the way. Like, in what sense? What does that mean? And you only need to dig a little bit beneath the surface to realize that we kind of don't really know much about any of this kind of stuff. So why was it that John the Baptist was like enough of interest to you that you decided to write about him?
Yeah. So there's a long version of that story, which I'll try and keep. I'll try and give as much of it as I think will be interesting, and leave out at least some of the details. You mentioned I wrote two books on the subject, so that at least hopefully indicates the level of interest that I'm bringing to this topic. But they're two very different books, right? So sometimes academics will write scholarly monograph, and then we'll do a sort of a popular version that's just like without the footnotes and stuff. But what I tried to do for this project was much more what I think we really need more of in fields like historical Jesus studies, right? Where sometimes you'll have a detailed study that makes a deep dive into some particular question, but you never get addressing of how does that fit into the bigger picture, right? And so you have this one piece of the puzzle given almost exclusive attention, or maybe several pieces of the puzzle, but you're not given any guidance into how those might fit together. And so what I tried to do is take a deep dive into some of the puzzling questions, mysterious things, questions of methodology, and then also write a general audience biography that I think will also be of interest to scholars that tries to put the story together, because I think we can figure out more about John than we have. So I start the biography with an analogy. I say that, people think they know him, right? But it's like a homeless person that you pass on the streets, every day. And when you actually ask the person, okay, so that person, he was always there. This was your route to work. Can you describe this individual? And suddenly it's like, well, shabbily dressed and, various things. And of course, a lot of people's stereotypical image of John is of this like wild, homeless looking man, right? Which is itself puzzling, because this person was more famous in his time than Jesus was, and extremely influential, which is hard to fit with some of the things that people think they know. And so, in addition to everybody saying they know John the Baptist, I think there's a lot of stereotypes and assumptions that may actually need to be challenged. So the way I found my way to the figure of John the Baptist and focusing in on him, it's a roundabout sort of way. I started off doing my doctoral work on the Gospel of John, and one of the things that I didn't really dig into there and just mentioned as sort of another topic related to the one that I did focus on was that gospel seems to be concerned polemically with views of John the Baptist, right? That gospel opens with, there came a man sent by John, right? That's the first human character to appear in the Gospel of John, right there in that prologue. And then it's emphatically, he was not the light. He came just to bear witness to the light. The true light was coming into somebody was saying John is the light, right? There's no need to be that emphatic if that's not happening. And so John's been on my radar for a long time, but as I spent time teaching, one of the courses I developed in an area that at that time was well outside of my normal area of teaching and research was to work on extra-canonical early Christian literature, including Gnosticism. And one really interesting Gnostic group that far too few people have heard of is known as the Mandaeans, right? You ask people, have you heard of Gnostics? Sure. Have you heard of the Mandaeans? A lot of people will say no, unless they're really, really interested in the subject. And yet, the Mandaeans are the last surviving Gnostic group from ancient times that made it down to the present day, right? And so they're still around. We can observe their rituals. Baptism is central to it. They have sacred texts in a dialect of Aramaic. They really like John the Baptist, and they're not fans of Jesus, like at all, right? And so it has been proposed plausibly that this group, in some way, shape, or form, owes something to followers of John the Baptist that did not become part of what became Christianity. And looking at, basically just putting together a collection of readings for this course, I took a look at the Mandaean texts, which those two had been on my radar, but not of great interest since my doctoral work, because there was a time in a bygone era when lots of people were relating Mandaean sources to the Gospel of John in particular. And what I realized as I was putting together this collection of readings for my students was that the two most important sacred texts of the Mandaeans had never been translated into English in their entirety. And I was like, how can this be, right? If these things were discovered today, I mean, they'd be making headline news the way that the Nag Hammadi discovery did, right? And so I took an interest. I started dabbling. I realized that unlike New Testament, where it's hard to find something new to say and a new angle on a well-worn text and much studied text, when it comes to the study of the Mandaeans, there are texts that have never been translated in their entirety. There are dozens, maybe hundreds of unanswered questions that nobody's working on. And just stepping into that field, even just dabbling initially in presenting a paper, I just discovered this is a fascinating place, and it's just so different from New Testament. And I knew as soon as I started getting involved in that, got an NEH grant, that's the National Endowment of the Humanities in the United States, to work on a translation project for a text that we sometimes refer to as the Mandaean Book of John, right? And that's John the Baptist. It's not a version of the Gospel of John. And I knew that if people in my main field of New Testament were ever to pay attention to this translation and the importance of these sources, then I was going to have to do, as a follow-up project, a deep dive into the historical John the Baptist, in which the case is made that those sources are relevant, right? They're later, right? They need to be treated with due caution, but they are not irrelevant and to be ignored in the way that has become the prevailing view in New Testament studies. And so this project really was an effort to do that, but it also brought together, some of my other interests in, things like Christology and the historical figure of Jesus. And so all of that sort of converged naturally. Basically everything that I had ever worked on throughout my academic career, starting from my doctoral work, really converged in this project. And it's, I'm definitely not done with John the Baptist.
Yeah,
there's more to be said.
I'm hoping that people listening to your explanation there, their ears will start perking up at various points. I mean, you said things like there were people who thought he was the light, which, given that the John's Gospel is calling Jesus the light, there are people who were thinking that John the Baptist is like the guy instead of Jesus. You talked about how there is a group of Gnostics who particularly like John the Baptist. I mean, these guys are really interesting because they don't think that John is the Messiah, right? But they do think that John is their most important prophet. And they've got a handful of prophets, like Adam is one of their prophets. I'm not sure if Abraham is one of their prophets. I don't think he is.
They don't.
I know that
they Abraham.
They reject Moses, for example. They include a few others. Like, which other prophets from the Old Testament do they have?
So they essentially have the early patriarchs. So it's the same kind of figures that are prominent in what we sometimes call Sethian literature, right, from among the Nag Hammadi texts. And so Seth features. He's referred to as Shittel, which is Seth El, right? So you have these interesting names that are used for like the celestial counterparts of the earthly figures, and so. Going back to like first century thought world, whether it's Philo of Alexandria or offshoots of the things that were in development in that time, the Gnostics, but also in rabbinic tradition, one of the ways that they made sense of these two creation stories in Genesis 1 and 2 was that God created a heavenly prototype to the earthly human. And so you get this exploration of this idea of celestial counterparts. And so you have a figure who's called Anush Utra, who's also a very important one, and that seems to be like angelic Enosh. But an interesting question is whether maybe there's been some pronunciation transformation over the centuries or something like that, and whether this could in fact be Enoch, right? Who, of course, features prominently in literature about celestial journeys and revelation and things like that. But yeah, so they don't like, as is also true of the Nag Hammadi texts, they don't like Judaism and Torah and things like that. And I think that, and this could get us away from John the Baptist at least a little bit. But one of the chapters in the book is about the origins of Gnosticism.
Yeah.
That's in the big book, John of History, Baptist of Faith. And I think that Mandaean sources do help us answer what has been a question that was just subject to speculation up until now. Where does this countercultural in the sense of, against Torah movement come from? Where they're interested enough in the Genesis creation stories to focus attention on them, and yet they interpret them subversively and say that this creator God is this inferior demiurge who makes, or doesn't even, so much make as organizes the material world and rules over it, and is at best an incompetent bungler and at worst a malevolent figure, and sometimes a bit of both. How do you end up with those things, right? Because if you are part of Judaism, you should like this deity, right? And if you're not part of that tradition, then why would you be so interested in these Jewish texts, right?
So Gnosticism, as listeners to this show will know, like within Gnosticism broadly, there is this idea that the creator of the material world is either evil or incompetent and not the true God. And this is something that crops up in Gnosticism. And these Mandaeans, which comes from Manda, which is the Arabic word for knowledge, I think, or gnosis at least.
Well, it's, Aramaic actually. I can't.
What did I say?
I think you said Arabic.
Oh, I meant to say Aramaic.
Yeah. Sure. I thought you might have meant Aramaic, but
yeah,
we mention Arabic much more often, and so it's an easy.
Yeah. The Aramaic name word for knowledge or gnosis. Yeah. Being Manda, that's where you get these Mandaeans, right. And there's two interesting things about them. One of which is that they're this ancient Gnostic sect that still exists, although in a small way today. Yeah. They're still around, but they're this ancient Gnostic sect. But there's this other interesting thing about them, which is that like their favorite prophet, their most important guy, is John the Baptist, and that they don't like Jesus. So the Gnostic stuff. You think that the discovery of their literature gives us an insight into the origins of Gnosticism?
Yes, I think that the reason why we have a close connection with early Christianity, and yet also some evidence that there were versions of this system of thought that were not Christian, right, but that have a close relationship nonetheless to Judaism and Jewish tradition, is because this emerges in the circles around John the Baptist. And we actually have an ancient Jewish Christian source known as the Pseudo-Clementine literature. And it claims that Simon Magus, right, who is this person who is blamed for being the originator of Gnosticism, was connected with John's movement. And
really?
It was him and either a student or a teacher of his, right, because sometimes the sources vary, but it seems like a teacher of his was even more directly connected with John, and that Simon basically ousted him in order to take charge of this sort of Samaritan branch of this movement. And that teacher's name was Dositheus, according to these sources, right? And it would be easy to treat some of these things, and obviously this is highly polemical literature, and so we do need to treat it with some skepticism, but sometimes highly polemical literature is giving you a caricature or distortion that relates to actual people, events, movements, and things like that. And we have evidence from Samaritan sources of a sect that they refer to as the Dustan sect, right? So the Dosithian sect. And one of the things it says about them is that they prayed standing in water, right? And so that sounds like a connection with this John the Baptist thing. Then we have the first Christian author, right, writing in Syriac, who actually quotes from a Mandaean text and is interacting with them directly, who refers to them, uses a number of different terms and labels, but one of them is Dostheans, right? And so it seems like a lot of these threads that connect John with Gnosticism suddenly start to appear in other places in ways that require some sort of explanation. And so it's fairly piecemeal, but given that there are traditions that associate John's movement, not John himself, but John's movement, with the origins of Gnosticism, and given that we have a Gnostic group that looks back to John the Baptist but doesn't like Jesus, suggests that the origins of Gnosticism should be traced back to the movement around John, but not necessarily either John himself or Jesus, right? And so these may be directions that certain branches of this movement took. And the reason I think this is important, even if you don't think, as I don't think John was a Gnostic, but if this emerged out of the circles around him, if we're trying to triangulate back to John, to follow the different branches to get this figure that inspired these different movements, the Jesus movement, the Gnostic thing, if we want to bring John into clearer focus, then tracing these threads back and figuring out what kind of figure could have inspired these different movements, I think is an important step in the effort to bring him into historical focus.
It's just, I'm so glad when all of my favorite subjects come together into one. And with your book, New Testament, John the Baptist, Gnosticism, Gospel of John, even a little bit of a sprinkle in there because that's your expertise too. It's brilliant, and it makes this figure all the more mysterious, like you say, because even if he himself is not a Gnostic, what is going on? Why is this man connected with this movement that gives us that fruit? By their fruits you shall know them. So let's explore that. I think the most important thing about John is that he had this nickname, the Baptist or the Baptizer, which, as you point out in your book, at the time is not a technical term, right? It just means immersion. Baptism is the same thing as immersion or dunking. So you quite, I think, entertainingly say that we might as well call him John the Dunker or John the Immerser. Like, this isn't a technical term. This is just a nickname. You also point out that at the time, immersion, like immersion pools as a religious ritual, were pretty common. And so there has to be something pretty special about what John was doing to give him a nickname of John the Baptist in a time when everybody was immersing themselves. It'd be like having the nickname Alex the Englishman while I live in England. I'd have to do something pretty particularly English to get that kind of nickname, right? So what was John doing when Jesus came upon him in the River Jordan?
Yeah, well, we see some discomfort developing. It's not there in the Gospel of Mark, interestingly enough, right? But as Jesus gets elevated, the fact that he underwent a baptism that was a baptism for the forgiveness of sins becomes something that some members of his movement are not entirely comfortable with, right? Which is,
yes, actually, can we spell that out? Is that the
Sure.
Gospels quite clearly say that John is preaching a baptism of forgiveness for the repentance of repentance for the forgiveness of sins. Like, this isn't like something that we've put onto the topic. This is said in the Gospels that John is baptizing people for repentance and forgiveness of sins, and then Jesus, the Lamb of God, the perfect man, God Himself incarnate, comes along and has a baptism of repentance for the forgiveness of sins.
And I think one of the things that tells us is that, the earliest Christian authors we have are not thinking of him in those terms yet, right? And when we get to the Gospel of John, where it's saying, he is the Word made flesh, right? Which may not mean quite what a lot of people assume, but he embodies this, divine presence, activity, whatever, revelation. He's described as the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world. But by that point, the Gospel of John also doesn't even explicitly say that John baptizes Jesus, right? It says it has John say, the reason I came baptizing, right, was so that he might be revealed to Israel. So there's this increasing discomfort, right? And it continues beyond the New Testament.
It's like implied that Jesus is baptized by John in John's Gospel, but he doesn't say so. And further to what you said earlier about John being a polemic, saying John the Baptist is definitely not the Messiah. Here's another subtle indication that John might have been acting polemically in intentionally not mentioning that Jesus was baptized by this other guy.
Yeah. And although I do get the sense that John probably had a certain degree of humility, as also did Jesus. You wouldn't get that impression, sometimes the way he speaks in the Gospel of John, but just as we see a lot of that as the words of this Christian author placing on the lips of Jesus sort of a defense of the Christian view of Jesus, right? And so you get this, high claim to authority, but also these statements that reflect a certain humility. I think that was probably true about John as well. But the words attributed to him in the Gospel of John, only found there, right? Jesus must increase and I must decrease, and things like that. There's reason to doubt whether those went back to the historical John. On the other hand, one of the things that's attributed to John in the synoptic tradition that also shows up in the Gospel of John is this idea that there's one coming after him who'll be stronger, whose sandals he's not even worthy to untie. And I think I solved a lot of questions about John in my books. I'm still trying to figure out, that's a very specific thing. It's like, I'm not even worthy to tie his shoelaces, right? I'm not worthy, I'm not worthy to do the laundry on his handkerchief or something. It's like you can see what the image might mean. You can kind of figure it out, but it's not an obvious thing to say, right? And so
I've not thought about that before. Yeah. I mean, I just kind of assumed it meant something like, oh, I'm not worthy to do anything, but to untie his sandals is, like you say, like it's possible there are undertones that we're simply not picking up on, that the readership of John's Gospel, in the 2nd century or late 1st century would have picked up on. And John here sort of being presented by the New Testament authors is interesting because, of course, it seems like the fact that Jesus was baptized by John is something that probably actually happened, and we can know that because if it didn't, it's not something that the gospel authors were likely to invent. John the Baptist was known as a religious teacher in his own right. He had followers. Some people thought he was the Messiah. And so for Jesus to come and be baptized by him sort of indicates that Jesus is accepting him as some kind of spiritual guider or leader or something, almost like he's joining his movement. And that's a pretty uncomfortable position to put, the Son of God into. And so do you think that historically this gives us an indication that at some point Jesus was some kind of disciple of John the Baptist?
Yes. I wouldn't even say, the only thing I would challenge in what you said was the almost, right? That he joined, he joined John's movement. And yet John seems to have said that, one coming after him, right, will be stronger. And I think, that may, one possible context for John rather to have said something like that is when he got wind that Herod Antipas was paying attention to him and likely to try to eliminate him. If you get rid of me, one of my disciples, right, one who comes after me, right, just like we get that in that language used for Christian discipleship, here too, it could have the same connotations. Somebody who's part of my movement will turn out to be even stronger than I am. And especially given that John seems to have styled himself as like the prophet Elijah. Elijah certainly stirred things up, but it was his disciple Elisha, right, who actually does sort of bring about the regime change and does some of these things. And so that may have been the way that John was thinking. And so Elisha might be stronger, right, than Elijah in terms of the forcefulness with which he acts. That doesn't necessarily mean greater, right? And it's interesting that we have attributed to Jesus a statement, which I think is unambiguous, that John is the greatest human being who was ever born. Right. And the Christian tradition certainly struggled to know what to do with that, given that, saying for Jesus to say, among those born of women, there's none greater than John the Baptist. Well, Jesus was born of a woman. And so case closed.
Yeah, that is fascinating. I kind of had assumed that quote excluded Jesus, but then right you are, he was also born of a woman. That's in Matthew 11 as... Truly, I tell you, among those born of women, there has not risen anyone greater than John the Baptist, although it is in other Gospels are available, as they say.
Yeah.
And there are different sort of versions of these stories, but what we do know is that John the Baptist crops up in more than just a baptismal capacity. Like you mentioned before, you said that John the Baptist was more famous than Jesus in his time, and people might listen to that and go, "Well, hold on a second, are you sure? Isn't that a bit conspiratorial?" But I don't think a lot of people pay attention to where John comes up, just how significant of a person that he is. You know, when Herod Antipas hears about Jesus, and there's rumors that there's this man going around, this teacher, this miracle worker, what are some people saying? It says in the Gospels, they think it's John the Baptist resurrected. You can imagine the kind of splash that Jesus was making in the ancient world. Famously, crowds following him, everybody's heard of him. For somebody to look at that and go, "Oh, it's another one of those John the Baptists." Who is this John the Baptist guy, and what was he doing? He must have been something pretty special.
Yeah. I mean, we have an indication, in the Gospels that he had an impact. People were paying attention to him sort of far and wide. It refers to him being active in the wilderness, or some sort of wilderness area. But that term is often taken to mean the desert, like in some isolated area, like he was a hermit. But in actual fact, the places that are mentioned are the wildernesses around the Jordan, right? And there were major thoroughfares going through there. And so he didn't focus on urban centers, but he sort of stood at the crossroads and had, a lot of opportunity to not just reach a large audience that way, but also reach a large audience that would then take what he was saying with them back to wherever they came from, right? Back to Transjordan, back to Galilee, back to other places. And it's interesting that in the book of Acts, we have reference to the Christian message, right? The message about Jesus, message focused on Jesus, reaching Ephesus. And it says that, Paul finds disciples there who've only been baptized with John's baptism. And so what sort of disciples are these? Presumably they're members of John's movement, right? Which had reached Asia Minor before this Christian offshoot of John's movement got there. And so we get a sense of just how influential John must have been. And that's why the depiction of him as this person who looks like he's unhinged and is, just, it's clearly wrong, right? This is somebody who religious, political leaders were paying attention to, and the general populace regarded him as a prophet, as somebody sent by God.
Yes. And indeed, we know that a lot of them must have thought that he was the Messiah because of the fact that sort of it has to be emphasized that he's not the Messiah, that's Jesus. In fact, at one point when Jesus asks his disciples, "Who do you say I am?" what's the first thing they say in response? Some say that you're John the Baptist. This is the big moment where he says, "Well, who do you say I am?" And Peter says, "You are the Christ." The first thing they say is, "Well, some people say that you're John the Baptist. Others say that you're Elijah." And it's like, some say that you're John the Baptist. Once again, reading through these Gospels, trying to pick up who this character is, you realize that he's not just some side character, right? And so this culminates, this particular attention on John the Baptist as an important figure, this culminates in him eventually being put to death, right? Can you tell us about that story?
Yes, so the story that I think, other than baptizing Jesus, the story that's most famous and maybe even is, slightly better known just because it's depicted so often in art and other things, is John the Baptist being beheaded, right, with the story of the dancing girl and all this kind of stuff. And just as with the details of what precedes Jesus' execution, historically, we need to practice due skepticism towards this very vivid story that the Gospel of Mark tells us. It's very unlikely that Herod Antipas had any reluctance to execute John. Josephus tells us that he wanted to execute John. The Gospel of Matthew, in retelling the story that was in Mark, also says that, right? Which is interesting. It's one of the ways that we know that Mark was used by Matthew, right? Because Matthew is taking over Mark's story, but changes it to something more plausible and says Antipas was looking for an excuse to kill him. And yet he forgets his editing, and just is copying from the source and keeps the detail that Antipas was sad when the request came for the head.
Oh, wow. That's really interesting.
And so it's, but
Huh.
just as with, the conversations between like Jesus and Pilate and that kind of stuff, where it's like, yeah, right, Pilate didn't want to execute this troublemaker.
Yeah.
What? Yeah, very, very out of character. Here too, I think that the effort to place the blame on women, rather than on Herod Antipas, is an effort to say, well, yes, so both of the major figures in our movement were executed by the figures who were in some way, shape, or form representatives of Roman power. But really, their hands were tied; they were forced to do it, and so you really shouldn't pursue us and do the same to us because we're part of this movement, right?
Yeah.
And so they're doing some damage control there. It's unlikely that anyone would have known the details about what happened, although we are told that a woman named Joanna, who was married to Herod's property manager, became a sponsor of the Jesus movement. And so it is possible that there was somebody with some inside knowledge. And so one other thing that people often don't notice is that Josephus says that John was imprisoned and eventually executed at Machaerus, which is in the desert. And yet the story in Mark has the request for John to be beheaded come when Herod Antipas is throwing a birthday party for himself, is hosting a birthday party for himself with the leading people in Galilee. And so he would have held that sort of thing at his new capital in Tiberias in Galilee. He wouldn't have said, well, let's all go away to the desert for a bit, right? And so presumably if there's any truth to there being a request for John to be beheaded and then the head being brought on a platter and delivered and things like that, we'd have to accept that Mark is compressing the time frame, right? And so, Antipas gives orders and word is sent and somebody brings word to Machaerus that John is to be executed and things like that. I think it's also interesting that both the Gospels and Josephus indicate that John was imprisoned in Machaerus for some time. He wasn't immediately executed. And that's, I think, something that's not always paid enough attention to, right? What was Herod Antipas hoping to accomplish by not simply eliminating this individual, right? Or what was it, what was there any constraint, right? And even if we think that being sympathetic to John is not the likely explanation, right? What we get Mark offering, enjoying listening to him, there was something, right? And so was it that he's hoping to figure out more about this movement and his followers, before cutting off the head of it? Because, sometimes you cut off the head and, the famous mythological image of you get 7 more popping up and so is it because he's worried that the followers might do something in response to the execution? And so he's trying to judge, whether it's safe before proceeding with simply eliminating him. It's very hard to say, but I think not enough people have asked, what's the delay about? What does it tell us about, how Antipas viewed John and thus about John?
Why is John imprisoned and then eventually executed? Like, what's the reason for that?
Yeah, well, so the answer Josephus gives is that Antipas was concerned about the crowds, which seemed like they might be ready to do anything that he might advise them to. And we'll come back to that in a moment, because I think there may be one thing that we know that somebody did, following John's advice or indication. The Gospel of Mark says that it's due to John criticizing Antipas's divorce from his first wife and marriage to his brother's ex-wife, right? They divorce and he marries her. And when we put those two together, we actually get a story that makes even more sense than either of them does on its own. Because Josephus tells us that the popular opinion when Herod Antipas was defeated by the ruler of Arabia named Aretas, which included Aretas taking Machaerus and conquering Machaerus, people thought that this was God paying or God ensuring that Herod Antipas was paid back for what he had done to John the Baptist. And so when we know that John was imprisoned at Machaerus, and that according to the Gospels, he criticized Herod Antipas for divorcing the princess of Arabia, Aretas' daughter, and mistreating her in that way and making this other marriage. And that set the people of Herod Antipas' territory on a course to be in conflict, right? And so I think that, like other prophets, in the long line of prophets, John is not just like, oh, you're disobeying the law, you're doing stuff that's naughty or something like that. He's concerned about, the political ramifications, the social ramifications of what rulers are doing. That this is, there's a reason why you're not supposed to just divorce and remarry at whim, and to treat your spouse in a fair way. And the injustice here is not just mistreatment of a woman, but this is dragging the whole people into conflict, right? And so it makes sense why people would then have said, yeah, John called him out on this. He was in prison at Machaerus. Then his first wife's father kicks his butt and takes Machaerus, and yeah, of course God had a hand in this, and this was justice being done. Coming back to that, the crowd seemed ready to do anything that he might indicate. Rulers in the ancient world, as also today, are always worried when somebody has the ear of the crowds. But that statement, they seem like they might be ready to do anything he advised. I'm guessing that might not have just been they were all getting baptized, right? And it's interesting that the Gospel of John has this different chronology to the other Gospels, and indicates that there was a period of time when Jesus was active, when John was not yet imprisoned. And so during that time, historically speaking, Jesus would have been part of John's movement. And the Gospel of John seems to be trying hard to have John directing all attention to Jesus, right? Which doesn't seem to be the way that things actually unfolded. And the Gospel of John places that famous action in the temple. The thing is sometimes called the cleansing of the temple, but it seems much more likely to be a foreshadowing of its destruction. Driving out the animals and the money changers, right? The things that were essential for the temple to continue its operations of offering sacrifice. And I think that action, was, whenever we place it, was an expression of Jesus as part of John's movement and an offshoot of John's movement, because John offering baptism for the forgiveness of sins was already taking aim at the temple, right? And providing what the temple offered, but by different means, and, so much more affordably, let's put it that way. If Jesus did this action when the Gospel of John says, a few years before the crucifixion, and while John was still at large, then not only might this be the kind of thing that drew Antipas's attention to John's movement, like he heard that, did you hear what one of John's emissaries did in Jerusalem? But also, Jesus may have thought of himself as having some responsibility for John being imprisoned, right? What he did at John's, even if it was at John's request, may have led quite directly to John being imprisoned. And so I think that John's imprisonment and eventually his execution actually also are key influences on how Jesus comes to think about his own messianic identity.
It's important to say, I think, that given the lack of direct and unbiased information that we have about someone like John the Baptist through the Gospels, a lot of this is essentially speculative. It's sort of a kind of educated guesswork, but it takes a lot of drawing out to see where you're getting these ideas from. And in your book, you do this. You take the time to demonstrate how the very act of baptism that John was proficient in is itself, like you say, contra to temple worship, because you're offering people what they're supposed to kind of only be able to get from the temple from somewhere else, and drawing out this idea of Jesus as historically one of John's followers, and this quote about them being willing to do anything. And I think it is a really interesting theory, and I think the thing that most people are going to be interested in all of that is the idea that there is this time where Jesus is going around considering himself to be a follower of John. The Gospels say that from the very beginning it was recognized that, like, it's the other way around. Like, John's like, no, not me. This is your man. If that's historically dubious, is there a point historically, do you think, that this does actually happen, where Jesus does actually just begin to think, actually, no, Is it? I mean, is it when John the Baptist dies? Is it after that, or is there some point where he goes, "I was a follower, but now I'm the teacher"?
Yeah. And as an educator, I would say that, I am most proud when my students become teachers. It's sort of a natural progression. And it's, one of the things that struck me as I was working on this project was that there is a saying attributed to Jesus, that no student is greater than his teacher, but a student, when they reach their full potential, can become like their teacher. And wouldn't he have been thinking about himself and John first and foremost? Even before thinking about his own students in relation to him. Either way, it potentially will fit. That saying, I think, will fit rather poorly with the way a lot of people think about Jesus as this figure who, well, no one could, sort of approximate who he was and what he did, right? But Jesus' own teaching seems to suggest otherwise.
It's really interesting parts of the Gospels where Jesus indicates that the disciples are kind of to do as he does one day. And of course, this is complicated by this separate topic of Jesus's, like, Christology, the idea that he's God, the idea that he's this particular individual. Missing in all of that, or a difficulty for all of that, are quotes like when Jesus says famously, I am one with the Father and I are one. He immediately says that he is in the Father and the Father's in him, and he says to his disciples, one day you will be hopefully in me in the way that and then I'll be in you. And so there's a lot of this kind of Jesus having this position of authority, but implying that at least some of it can be given to the disciples. In John chapter 20, Jesus sends out his disciples with the ability to forgive sins. He says, as the Father has sent me, now I'm sending you. If you forgive people's sins, they're forgiven. If you do not, then they're not. And it's like, well, yeah, maybe there is this feeling that you've got a follower of John the Baptist who then says, actually, now it's my turn. And nearing the end of his ministry says, okay, this whole forgiveness of sins stuff that started with John the Baptist and I kind of took over, now it's on you, the apostles, to go out and do the same thing. But of course, this is complicated by the fact that on top of these little clues, we've got a theology, and we've got a gospel which tells us that Jesus is so much more, that he's the Son of God, that he's the Messiah, that he's the Son of Man, and all of this kind of stuff. And it makes it quite difficult to understand how Jesus actually saw himself.
Yes, and that is a genuine difficulty. And the challenge, I think, for historians, this has always been true, but I don't think those of us who've been interested in historical research on Jesus have always kept the balance that's needed here, is that on the one hand, we can detect a trajectory, right? And that eventually gets us to things like the Council of Nicaea, right? Where Jesus is the incarnation of the second person of or actually at that point, it's not even thinking exactly in Trinitarian terms yet, but a figure that is of one substance with the Father, right? And the church spent a lot of time getting to that point. But there's a trajectory that gets us from the historical Jesus to there. And so we know that we need to peel back some layers of development in order to bring the historical Jesus into focus. On the other hand, sometimes I think there has been a swinging of the pendulum to the opposite extreme, where it's almost an effort to get back to a Jesus who doesn't have any high view of himself whatsoever. And there are enough sayings attributed to Jesus that seem to be authentic, that have a strong case to be made in their favor, that becomes implausible, right? One famous example is the promise, you will sit on 12 thrones judging the 12 tribes of Israel, which most scholars think, the version in one of the Gospels is changed. It's you will sit on thrones rather than you will sit on 12 thrones, because, of course, one of the 12 that Jesus was addressing then was Judas. And with hindsight, Jesus promising you will sit on 12 thrones, including Judas, is sort of problematic, right? And so if he envisages his apostles, his appointees, sitting on 12 thrones judging the 12 tribes of Israel, then what's he doing, right? And so presumably he is of a higher status. And an interesting question is, does he at this point think of both himself and John as having a higher status, right? So when it comes to thinking about John as the Messiah, right, which we know some people were thinking, it's not entirely clear whether John and or Jesus thought in terms of that sort, but there was an expectation of what we might call two messiahs, right? Messiah is just a transliteration of a word that means anointed one. And there were two figures who were installed in office with a ceremony that involved anointing, the high priest and the king. And both of the rightful holders of these positions, according to the Jewish law and according to the scriptures of Judaism, were no longer holding them, right? So people like Herod the Great, even the Maccabees, right, are not of the line of David. Somebody else other than the line of Zadok was holding the high priesthood. And so there were groups that hoped for the restoration of these roles to their rightful holders. And one interesting possibility is that John may have come to see himself as a messianic figure, right, in the strict sense, but he's a priestly Messiah, right, who is carrying out an activity in a non-traditional way, right? So not by offering sacrifices in the temple, but by some other means. And so between that and his arrest and execution, it may be that Jesus came to think of himself and believe he's the stronger one that John promised, and thus will be the Davidic king, but that he too maybe first has to follow a path more like John's, right? That involves suffering and rejection. And that only then would God intervene to vindicate both of them and show that they were right. There's only one place where I think that view of maybe John and Jesus as two messiahs shows up in the New Testament, and it's in the book of Revelation, right? Where there's this reference to two witnesses, right, sort of in the holy city, who are killed, and their bodies lay on the streets and are exposed. But then, like after 3 days, they're raised up. And did that reflect an expectation that sort of John and Jesus, right, would be raised and vindicated? Because the two witnesses are said to be the two lampstands, right? And that's an image from the book of Zechariah, where you have the high priest and the king, or these two anointed figures, and the lamps are these sort of oil lamps, and it's all connected with that imagery. And so do we have a hint there of a time when you had this messianic view of John and Jesus?
Wow. Well, what's the Christian interpretation of that passage of who these two people are?
I mean, sometimes it's been like it's Peter and Paul, or some two witnesses in Rome, or something like that. There's good reason to think that we have in the Book of Revelation a work that had an earlier form, and it's interesting. There is one person whose view I do not subscribe to, but I think there's still something really interesting in terms of the connection with the John the Baptist movement. So J. Messingburg Ford wrote a commentary on the Book of Revelation that is not widely used because she had a really unusual view that this was a Christian reworking of a work that was originally by someone named John, and that John was John the Baptist. And so this was actually a work by John the Baptist, but then edited by Christians to become a Christian work, which I think is fascinating, wow, right? And I'm not ready to go there. We'll see if I ever turn my attention to Revelation, whether I change my mind about that. But what is interesting is that we have both this sort of dual Messiah thing that pops up there with the two witnesses, and we have the woman who gives birth to a messianic child being chased into the wilderness, which mirrors a story that's told about John and his mother fleeing into the wilderness, right, when supposedly Herod the Great was after them, right, which we find at the end of the infancy gospel of James, right? It's mostly about Mary and then about Jesus, and then suddenly it's only about John and his parents. And we also get in the Mandaean tradition storytelling about John being whisked away to safety, right, and things like that, and then making a reappearance. And so it seems like there is, in more places than we realize in the New Testament, there are traces of traditions that were connected with John and his movement that take on a very different form when they're transformed as part of these early Christian documents.
I want to talk a bit more about these Mandaeans, because, like you say, they might provide a link to the historical original followers of John the Baptist, though it's not entirely clear that they are actually a historical continuation. They certainly see themselves that way. They think they are the people that we see referred to as followers of John the Baptist. The ones that don't become Christians go on to become these Mandaeans. And like you say, they've got religious scripture of their own. And as far as I understand, they're quite protective over it. Like we're kind of not supposed to be reading it as non-Mandaean. So sorry if they're only watching, but we won't show it on screen perhaps. But the most interesting thing, I think, because I haven't read the whole Mandaean Book of John, although perhaps one day, I did scan over its depiction of the baptism of Jesus. Because the Mandaeans, although like you say, they don't like Jesus very much, they still think that John baptized Jesus. What is different between our gospel account of this baptism and the Mandaean account of the baptism?
Yeah, so in the Mandaean account, right, it reads as though, and it's hard to know at what stage this might have happened, but it does read as though it's aware of how Christians are depicting this event, and there's some deliberate parodying of it, right? And that's one of the challenges, not just in studying the Mandaean texts, right? But it's one reason why I think some have just set them aside. It's like, well, there's some indication that there's material that might be derivative of, and dependent on Christian literature. And the truth is that just because Matthew and Luke used Mark doesn't mean that Matthew and Luke can't embed other traditions and even know some of the things that Mark knew, but know them in a different version, and maybe one that was more authentic, right? Because the fact that Mark wrote first doesn't mean that he was completely honest and didn't transform anything, and then everybody else who came along later was distorting his pure, right? That's not the way storytelling works. And so there may be things in this story, even if it reflects polemical engagement with Christian storytelling, that reflect how others of John's followers who didn't become part of the Jesus movement viewed Christian storytelling, and included some elements that reflected their own independent knowledge. One of them is that Jesus in the story asks to, if we go with the modern meaning, the later meaning of the term in Mandaic, which is a dialect of Aramaic, it would mean, I want to be ordained, but it's a word that comes from the Aramaic word for disciple, right? And so taking it in its root meaning, Jesus asks John to baptize him and make him his disciple, right? Which is at best implicit in the Christian version of it, but is explicit there, right?
This is in the Mandaean Gospel of John. Jesus says this
in the Mandaean Book of John, and
Book of John,
and it's really quite hilarious in a lot of ways, right? The Mandaeans, they love puns, which I think, we see that as something that John and Jesus seem to have had in common. And the Mandaean tradition certainly had preserved that as an element of their storytelling. And so Jesus is supposedly this great, sort of skilled teller and interpreter of parables. And yet John addresses Jesus with some parables, and he takes them in this woodenly literal way, and misses the point of them. And it's really sort of religious satire at its finest. If you're a Christian, you have to have a thick skin when reading it, of course, because it's criticizing Jesus. But the Mandaean tradition wasn't entirely comfortable with John baptizing Jesus. Like, wouldn't John have seen that he was a troublemaker, right? That he was bound to be, And so elsewhere in Mandaean literature, we have John simply baptizing Jesus, and then Jesus goes off the rails. Here, John seems to be aware that Jesus is trouble. And so it's only when there's like basically a letter from up above, right? So like in the Christian tradition, you get the voice from heaven. But in the Mandaean version, there's essentially a voice or a letter from heaven saying, baptize the deceiver, right? This is not on you, John, right? You're off the hook. Okay. We know he's going to be trouble, and, go ahead with it anyway. And then the Spirit makes an appearance, but as with the God of the Jews, Adonai, Ruha, the Spirit, is also a malevolent figure in this tradition, right? And so it's just fascinating the way they tell the story. One thing that have pointed to more than once as indicating likely embedding of early tradition and very ancient tradition in this story. One of the things that John accuses Jesus of is loosing the Sabbath which Moses ordained. And it's that, it's in Aramaic, but that's the expression, loosing the Sabbath, right? Untying the Sabbath. And that's exactly the meaning of an accusation that the Jewish authorities bring against Jesus in the Gospel of John in the New Testament, chapter 5. And the reason that this indicates some sort of early tradition is that once they take their Gnostic form, they no longer view the Sabbath that Moses ordained as a good thing, right? And so Jesus untying it, loosing it, abolishing it, disregarding it would not be a point of criticism, right? And so the only way this makes sense on the lips of John is if this was part of the story even before that branch of John's movement took its Gnostic turn and remained part of the story. And it would mean that some of John's movement were more conservative in some ways with regard to the Jewish law than some elements of the Jesus movement were, right? And so it's striking that we get sometimes attributed to just generic Jewish authorities or things like that, things that elsewhere are attributed to John or his movement, right? Suggests that at least some of John's followers understood John in a more conservative way, right? And so there too, I think that between the conservative Jewish and the Gentile mission-oriented versions of Christianity, the emergence of Gnosticism, right? The emergence of, and the likelihood that this influences other strands within Jewish and Samaritan tradition, John seems to have had a vision for, bringing together, as we might say today, a broad coalition, right? And people who were clearly really skilled, intellectual, insightful individuals. And of course, when you have somebody who is esteemed as a teacher and a key influence in a time, then like if they're considered an artistic genius, a musical genius, all these other people gather around them, and oftentimes what they end up doing, it reflects the influence, but also then takes it in a different direction. And I think that's exactly the role of John, is that he brought together a lot of the thinkers and the activists of his time, because he was this person who was thought to be a genius with ritual and with word and with teaching and with social change.
So we know, everybody knows the story of Jesus getting baptized by John the Baptist as told by the Gospels. In the Mandaean book of John, Jesus approaches John the Baptist and asks him to baptize him and pronounce over me the name you pronounce. And he says, if I become your disciple, I shall mention you in my epistle. If I do not become your disciple, then erase my name from your scroll. And then John spoke, saying, and this is me reading out the text, John spoke, saying to Jesus Christ in Jerusalem, you have lied to Jews, and you have deceived men, the priests. You cut seed off from men, and labor and pregnancy from women. You loosened the Sabbath that Moses ordained in Jerusalem. You lied to them with a horn, and played different things with a trumpet. And Jesus seems to go on to deny these things. He says, if I've lied to the Jews, then may a burning fire consume me. If I've deceived the priests, may I die 2 deaths instead of 1, But there's this bizarre, battle that begins to happen between John the Baptist and Jesus. And Jesus is like, come on, man, baptize me. And he even says, I don't know if this is sarcastic, I don't know if it's serious, where he says, if you baptize me, I'm going to write about you in my memoirs, It's a really, really strange sort of set of circumstances. And like you say, that loosened the Sabbath, which Moses ordained. Given that the Mandaeans reject Moses as a prophet, it's unlikely that they would just make that up out of nowhere, right?
Yeah. And it's interesting that we get that accusation, that Jesus was accused in that way, right? According to the Christian tradition. I think there are also other points of intersection there, right? I mean, you'll be mentioned in my memoir, right? Is a great way of putting it, right? It's there are these Christian texts that claim to be sort of memoirs of the apostles connected with the Jesus movement, and they mention John, but of course Mandaeans don't think they depict John accurately, just like they don't think they depict Jesus accurately. And the tooting with the trumpet thing, is also because there's a saying attributed to Jesus about, when you do good works, don't trumpet them and things like that. And so, uh, then there's also the cutting off of seed, which is, accusing Jesus of monasticism, which it's not clear. So some of this probably reflects ongoing debates, right? And that's one of the other hard things I wrestled with, and I tried to bring some initial stabs at getting some clarity on these things, but there's a lot more work to be done. How much of the disagreement between John and Jesus in Mandaean texts is like the disagreements between John and Jesus, or the being at not quite at odds, but saying different things in the Gospel of John? How much of this reflects stuff that John and Jesus would have said to one another, and how much of it is this movement that is fracturing, telling the story in different ways, polemically? And so figuring out which are the issues that might have gone back to John and Jesus, and, if any, and which ones reflect later debates between what was one movement now becoming two movements around focused on John and Jesus. There's a lot more historical work to be done on that.
One thing that we haven't actually explained or talked about much is baptism. Like we've talked about John, who was going around baptizing people, and we've mentioned that it just means immersion. Like we know that it involves water, but how much do we know about what baptism actually is? Why John the Baptist seemed to be obsessed with water, like why his whole movement seemed to be surrounded by like immersion in water. Like where did that come from?
Yeah, and we don't have a story about sort of John discovering baptism. One possibility is that, if he leaves home trying to figure out, what he's supposed to do, and, immersing in water, maybe catches a glimpse of himself, and, somehow it resembles, it seems like not his own image looking back. It's, more like what he imagines the prophet Elijah looks like, or something like that. You can imagine how, certainly there's a long history of people undergoing immersion, seeking, a spiritual experience. That wasn't the dominant form of immersion in that time. And the way we know that John's immersion was not just the purity immersion of that time is one that you mentioned, that he becomes known as the immerser, which is very hard when you have so many people immersing all over the place. But also there are these stories about his authority being challenged, right? By what authority do you do this if you're not the Christ or Elijah or the prophet?
Yes, this is said to Jesus, to be clear. Like so Jesus is accused later in the canonical Gospels. By what authority do you do these things?
Yeah, and there he says, well, I'll ask you a question. John, what was his authority, right? So he links himself with John's authority there, which is interesting. But in the Gospel of John, right, and I'm not suggesting that this was a historical incident with the dialogue preserved, but in the Gospel of John, Jewish authorities come to John and ask him, what's your authority to do this thing, right? Why do you baptize if you're not the Christ or Elijah or the prophet, right? So in other words, to do this thing that was offering forgiveness by a different means requires authority, right? And the very fact that the question of John's authority to baptize comes up suggests that he was doing what the Gospel of Mark and other sources say, namely offering a baptism that was offering the forgiveness of sins, right? It required repentance, but it's for the forgiveness of sins. And even in the early Christian preaching described in the book of Acts, right? At which point it's barely a Jesus-focused movement, right? It's the Jesus branch of John's movement. They are still proclaiming, repent and be baptized for the forgiveness of sins, right? That's their message. And so we see that there's continuity into the early Jesus movement that gets overshadowed and gets lost along the way as Jesus is elevated and John is submerged, maybe is the right word to use. So I think that John, right, and one of the more speculative, but I think plausible things that I explore in my books is that we have these dual traditions of John as dedicated as a lifelong Nazirite, right, like Samuel and Samson had been, and also the son of a priest. And priests were required to keep their hair trim, right, according to the Torah, and later texts like the book of Ezekiel and the rabbinic literature make it even more explicit. And Nazarites were prohibited from doing that. And so if John found himself torn between two incompatible roles that he inherited, that might have provided a catalyst for him to ask, okay, so what am I supposed to do with my life, right? If I'm not going to be, I'm the son of a priest who is not going to serve in the temple. I've been dedicated in a way that was rare, and and Samuel, of course, is the one who anoints David, right? But the prophet remains an authority over the king, right? And so there is the possibility that John thought of the coming one as a Messiah and thought of himself mainly in prophetic terms, but without any implication that because the king is stronger, that like he's the ultimate authority and the prophet is not ultimately, as the spokesperson for God, the one that even the king should be subject to.
Yeah, that's why I'm quite interested in this unworthy to untie his sandal, because that tells us a lot as to whether he's sort of saying that out of reverence to the king, or whether he means it as a sort of authority placement, and that, as you say, probably requires more exploration. But that's interesting. So we know that, because the other thing that we haven't spoken about is the birth narrative. Sometimes it's forgotten that in Luke's birth narrative of Jesus, it begins with the birth of John the Baptist, or the pregnancy of Elizabeth, his mother. And we're told that there's this miraculous story. We're told this miraculous narrative that Elizabeth can't have children, she's too old, but they're praying for a child, and God miraculously gives them this child, and that child is John the Baptist. And when Elizabeth is pregnant, she goes to meet Mary, who she's a relative of, and John does a backflip in the belly. And there's a lot in there. I mean, one thing is that we know that Zechariah, the father, is a priest, and the way that we know, so priesthood is like an inheritable office at that time. So it would have been expected that John becomes a priest in the same way, and that's in the infancy. That's in the gospel narrative there, but it's also in the Mandaean sources that his father was Zechariah the priest. So probably was known that was actually the case. And like you say, they have to trim their hair. But we also get this indication that because Elizabeth is a relative of Mary, we're not given much more information, that Jesus and John the Baptist are related to each other. But then I think a lot of scholars think that this is a dubious connection, because that whole birth narrative is suspiciously similar, as you point out, to the miraculous birth of Samuel in 1 Samuel. And so it kind of looks as if the author of Luke's Gospel has copied the birth of Samuel from the Old Testament and applied it to John the Baptist. What do you think about the historicity of that story?
Yeah, so the main point to emphasize is that from the perspective of a historian, infancy traditions are not the place to look for reliable historical detail as a rule, right? Because ancient biographies, right? So this is not at odds with treating these as sources that are about actual historical figures, but ancient biographies regularly introduce them with tales of wondrous portents that indicate, symbolically how great and wonderful this person that the biography is going to be about would be, right? And so this is pretty much par for the course. And it's clear that Luke or Luke's source is patterning the story, particularly the story about John the Baptist, on the story of Hannah and Samuel. And we also have, hints of the Moses story in Matthew's infancy story, which is just focused on Jesus. And yet, looking at both of these, historians tend to say they probably would have remembered what the names of Jesus' parents were and would have included those kinds of details. And so I think that things like the names Zechariah and Elizabeth, right, which are also there in the Mandaean tradition, are likely to be historical. And it seems as though things like his father being a priest are the kinds of things that would have been known, right? Because people, before they listen to anyone, they want to know who is this person, right? And people's reputation depended on, ancestry and things like that in this particular cultural context. And whether John was a Nazarite, looked like he was a lifelong Nazarite, whether he had long hair, whether,
Now,
That's
to be
something that would have been
clear,
visible, right?
Nazarite is not to be confused with Nazarene. So a Nazarene is just someone from Nazareth, but a Nazarite is a particular kind of religious observer. So they grow out their hair, they abstain from alcohol, they abstain from defilement by touching dead bodies. But it's some kind of particular reverence that involves the growing out of your hair.
Yeah, yeah. And so most people, I think, if they have any prior contact with the Bible, will at least know Samson was one, right? Although he's a very not a typical one, right? The hair was not thought to give superhuman strength, right? This is sort of a mythical, magical kind of take on the Nazarite thing. But a lot of times people forget that Samuel, right, is depicted in that way. And these are the only two figures that were depicted as being lifelong Nazarites, right? So it was much more like you imagine somebody taking a vow and saying, you know, until this government cedes this point, I will, I refuse to cut my beard or something like that, right? It's like somebody saying, I'm going to, dedicate myself to this, and for that time, or I'm not going to touch booze again until I have accomplished this goal that I've set for myself, or whatever it is. And so a Nazarite vow was usually that sort of thing, something that somebody took for a period of time, and then they ended it and they shaved their head and they went back to normal. And it's interesting that we have in Mandaism the term Nasarai used for basically somebody who is adept, skilled in the esoteric knowledge of the Mandaean tradition. And so whether that goes back to, Nazarite, whether it goes back to the fact that in this movement, the person at the center was a Nazarite and his right-hand man was a Nazarene, and so they were doing a pun thing. But it's fascinating that this term, which sounds a lot like a term that appears in the New Testament, also shows up in the Mandaean tradition, right? Because they don't like Jesus, so they're not going to be borrowing it from Christians, and so what's it doing there?
Where do we get this idea of John as a lifelong Nazarite from? Are we told explicitly that this is the case, or is it something we infer?
Yeah, so it's implicit, at the very least, in the Gospel of Luke, right, where it's like he will never touch wine or strong drink, right? In the Jewish tradition, that was enough to indicate that this is a Nazarite vow.
And that is a vow that Elizabeth is making on behalf of John.
I mean, so it's in the story, it's simply mentioned by the angel. Right? I think that we can, if I'm right about some of the infancy source material, then there may have been a more explicit version about Elizabeth playing a role much more like the one that Hannah does, right? But in echoing the Hannah story,
Hannah is Samuel's mother.
Hannah is Samuel's mother, and Hannah says, if you grant me a son, I will, dedicate him, right? And he will be dedicated as a Nazarite all his life. And implicit in John's dedication as a Nazarite all his life to this woman who is patterned on, right? Her story is patterned on that of Hannah, right? There is this implication that there's this dedication, even before he's born, to this vow. And that's, it's interesting. One of the other things that there hasn't been all that much research on, I was surprised when I was working on this project that John as a new Samuel, right? Most scholars working on the New Testament have been Christians or post-Christians or something like that. And so the interest still goes, first and foremost to Jesus and then everyone who comes after him. And so there are things about John's depiction, even in the New Testament, that deserve further exploration than they've received.
But it's amazing how much information we do have. Like, back to my first question that I've been asking my friend recently, like, who is John the Baptist? It's like, well, he's the guy that baptized Jesus. He's the first person mentioned in Luke's first birth mentioned in Luke's infancy narrative. He's the man who is Jesus is accused of being John the Baptist at least twice, once directly and once as being him resurrected. He's a man that's put to death, but in this fantastical beheading and the head being placed on the silver platter and all that. There's loads and loads of stuff going on, which indicates that at the very least, he was an important dude. he wasn't just some guy that came to prepare the way and nothing else. He quite obviously had his own stuff going on, his own ministry, and we even have the echoes of his religious community today with their own literature that is part of this bizarre Gnostic reinterpretation of the way that the world works, and different entities and creators and demiurges and all this kind of stuff, and all of this packed into this one mysterious character who's right at the front of the Gospels.
Yeah. He's also the first character mentioned, right? The first human character mentioned in the Gospel of John.
In John, I point this out to people. I sort of say that the famous "in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God." Like before the whole Word became flesh thing, you get John the Baptist and this emphatic assertion. John the Baptist, who was not the Messiah, was preparing the way for Jesus, the Messiah. And John the Baptist himself, not being the Messiah, was the person who, because he was not the Messiah, it really wants you to know that he's not the Messiah. And that alone should be enough to perk your ears up, I think. What does that tell us about what people thought at the time?
Yeah. He confessed and did not deny, but confessed. It's like, okay, you're... Clearly somebody doesn't think that if you need to be that emphatic about it.
Yeah. Do you think that the stuff that we've discussed today could or should affect a typical Christian understanding? Because a Christian might listen to this and feel a bit uncomfortable. Jesus possibly a disciple of somebody else, Jesus having a baptism for the forgiveness of sins. I mean, that part isn't even controversial, but there's a lot in here that might sort of trouble a traditional Christian understanding, right?
Well, the thing I always say is, particularly, having come, was born into the Catholic tradition, but found my way into and still within the Protestant tradition. And in the Protestant tradition, the scriptures are supposed to be the ultimate authority. If things that emerge when you pay attention to them and don't just try to sort of deny them away, if things that are found in the pages of these texts make you uncomfortable, then maybe you should be uncomfortable, right? Maybe your thing that you imagine is, Bible believing Christianity, is not that. And maybe one aspect of it is that the Bible has a lot more different stuff in it than the pieces you've chosen in order to assemble your viewpoint. It's interesting. I wrote a book on another subject, but not unrelated, called What Jesus Learned from Women. And some of the response to that, too, was, he couldn't learn from anybody. He was God. And it's clear that there you have a popular view of Jesus that actually has veered into a stance about him and beliefs about him that historically were condemned as heretical by orthodoxy, right? What became orthodoxy was that there's full divinity, but also full humanity, right? Without either being diminished and nobody has actually managed to formulate a coherent view that meets all the requirements of the Creed of Chalcedon. And so you can understand why people keep veering off into things that are at odds with it. It's pretty much inevitable. But it's interesting that so many Christians are willing to say, oh, well, but not that because he was divine, right? And to downplay the humanity because of their belief in his divinity. And they never say, oh, well, not that divine attribute because he was human, right? And so it's clear that a lot of modern Christology and a lot of modern Christian thinking about Jesus is off kilter. It's unbalanced. It is leading heavily in one direction where the creeds and the definitions of orthodoxy said it should be balance between two different things. And I'm not advocating for Christian orthodoxy. I'm just pointing out that there's this disconnect, right? And that, for Protestants at least, right, it's not the creeds that are supposed to be the authority, it's the Bible. And yet so much of the Bible is read through the lens of these later creedal definitions of who Jesus is and what it means to say that he's the Word made flesh, things that are not spelled out in that precise way within the pages of the New Testament themselves.
There's so much more to say, and that's why you wrote 2 books about the subject. I mean, topics not included include, for example, the suggestion that John the Baptist was an Essene, and this is a really popular suggestion that people like to bring up. But in your book, you explain why that might be a little bit dubious and sort of like a bit a bit groundless, right? Also, we talked about water, and you give some ideas as to where this importance of water in John's like baptismal ministry might have come from. In Ezekiel, at the end of Ezekiel, we're told about the construction of the new glorious temple one day in the future. And one of the interesting things about this temple that's imagined at the end of Ezekiel is that it has water flowing out of it, and that water brings the gifts of the temple to, like, people outside, and that water sort of it's something about that water which allows what is in the temple to be brought outside of the temple too. And that maybe John had read this and thought, well, I'm not so keen on this temple stuff because I'm not going to be able to teach in the temple because I'm a Nazirite, but I was supposed to be a priest. And so he's out in the wilderness, and it's something to do with the water. And all of this stuff is fascinating, and it all kind of comes together in some really interesting ways. So is it fair to say that the scholarly work is, the book's title is John of History, Baptizer of Faith, and the popular level work is Christ Maker, A Life of John the Baptist? That's a good distinction, like sort of scholarly versus public. Is that how you consider those books?
Yes, but I'd also say that, if you want the deep scholarly, investigation of, how might baptism have been invented, right? And looking at the sources, looking at things in obscure languages, at least obscure from the perspective of, English-speaking world scholars, then the big book is a place to look for those kinds of things. The other one is telling John's story, right? It's trying to narrate it as a biography. And I think a lot of people who read the biography will want at least some of the arguments for, okay, but what's the basis for that conclusion, right? And so I try to do both those things. I think in the past, I've tended to try to squeeze all of that into like one book. And this was the first time where I tried keeping those things separate, and I think it really did work well. I mean, I'm happier with having kept them separate. I think otherwise I would have had a book that wasn't quite doing either what a general audience wanted or what scholars wanted.
Yeah, well, certainly what happened with me is I was reading Christ Maker, and I switched to then diving into the bigger book. And I think that if you're listening to this, like if you're interested in the sort of Gnostic element, if you're interested in all that kind of stuff, then the big book is the way to go. But if you just want to hear all of this put together in a narrative form that makes sense from beginning to end, then Christmaker is what to do. But hey, why not buy them both? They're both linked down in the description, so check them out. James McGrath, thanks so much for coming on. It's been a good one.
Alex O'Connor, it's great talking with you, and I really hope this is not our last conversation, because we're just scratching the surface of the things that apparently we're both really, really interested in.
I'm sure we'll speak again soon.
There's kind of a cachet with the scrolls too. It just sort of feels like I noticed that with the Danny Jones podcast too, right? Like in the episode I did with him, I think has 700,000 views or what have you, where like it's twice as many as like the stuff that he did for several months prior to that, and then afterwards too, right? So it's,
maybe
but I
just
think
you.
nah, I mean maybe, but I suspect as soon as you stick that in the title, people are like, well, this is the Dan Brown effect, right? This is the one thing prior to when I read the novel. I heard about the novel, but people were like super excited about it, right? And I figured I need to read this. And when I did read it, I chuckled because there's like this one part in it where he meets with the scholar philanthropist billionaire, what's his name, Teabing, I think is the character's name, who's providing him all this evidence, right, for the Merovingian connection to
Yes.
Jesus. And then he's like, well, where does, like, tracing the threads of this, he's like, how far back do you connect this, or where does this connect? And the guy just says, well, all you have to do is read the Dead Sea Scrolls, and that was it. It's the only thing he said
Does
about
it say
them,
that?
right?
Does it really say
He does. He really does. And it's the sort of thing that most people would not remember, right? But because it's me, because it's anybody who's in the field, it's all we're like, fucking guy, right? Like it's like, and he doesn't explain anything either. Like it just doesn't even attempt. It's just a throwaway line, and I'm sure it's because it sounds great. It's
Well, the thing about the Dead Sea
mysterious.
Scrolls is that they are, even the name, like, because they happen to have been discovered near something called the Dead Sea. There's just something so sort of mysterious about
There's a
it, and
mystique to it.
it's got that Dan Brown thing. It's got the sort of like hidden text in the desert, the sort of Gnostic gospel feeling of these texts that get dug up, kind of thing. So, what actually are the Dead Sea Scrolls? What are
All
they?
right. The Dead Sea Scrolls are a collection of Jewish, or I should say, of a series of collections of Jewish manuscripts dating between the 3rd century BCE to roughly the 2nd century CE, so covering a period of maybe 400 years, probably a little less than that though. And they are manuscripts, they're scrolls that were discovered in a series of sites along the western shore of the Dead Sea in Israel. Most of the Dead Sea Scrolls came from a site we call Qumran, which comprised 11 caves, and I'm sure we'll talk a little bit about that as we move forward. And these were the first of the scrolls were discovered in this area, but the term has come to cover a lot more material since then. There have been discoveries of manuscripts further south of Qumran at places like Murabat and Nahal Khavar and Masada. I'm sure you've heard of. The Masada is the spur on the cliffs on the southern shore of the Dead Sea where Herod the Great built his winter palace.
Yes, I've been there.
And yes, it's did you take the tram or did you hike it?
We took the tram.
Yeah.
We were short on time, okay? We weren't. It
Right.
wasn't
Yeah. No,
wasn't a
me
laziness thing.
too. So, and that's the I can provide the excuse that I was traveling with Peter Flint, and he really wanted to take the tram and didn't want to hike. So there you go. But yes, but when you were at Masada, undoubtedly they pointed out, or you saw the so-called synagogue on the site.
I'm sure we will have been. Well, actually, we didn't have a tour or anything. We were just kind of
Oh,
walking
okay.
around, and so
Yeah.
I'm not sure that we will have noticed, to be honest.
So there's a structure that has been identified as a synagogue just on the basis it's a meeting hall, right? And it's got like stone benches built into the sides of the walls and like Roman pillars sort of in the center of it, and it resembles um what we know of Jewish synagogues from later periods of time. So this has been commonly interpreted as a synagogue. It might be, I just don't know. But one of the really interesting things about it, and this probably led to further solidify this identification. There was a I think it was a wall compartment or a floor compartment near this particular structure where they opened it up and they found Hebrew manuscripts written in Hebrew, Jewish manuscripts, copies of texts from the Old Testament, but also some other really interesting things. Like there is a Hebrew copy that was discovered there of the book of Ben Sira, which we only know from the Greek. This is one of the apocryphal books, and here they discovered a copy of Hebrew text from Ben Sira, one of the only copies we have. But anyways, the Dead Sea Scrolls are Jewish manuscripts that were discovered in this region, basically, the Judean desert, in and around the Dead Sea. And in terms of the numbers, we're talking about hundreds and hundreds of scrolls that were written predominantly on vellum or leather, but a handful also on papyrus, and quite a few containing texts from the Old Testament, from the Hebrew Bible. But this probably only represents about 30% of the total number of texts. There's a lot more literature in this grouping of manuscripts. So that's what they are.
The biblical stuff is what most people are interested in, because these are discovered in the mid 40s, right? Or 45 or 47, around there, I think.
Yeah, so they were first discovered in 1947. The discoveries extend generally from 1947 to closer to 1960, when some of the later manuscripts in caves were found. It's a fairly famous story. A shepherd looking for his lost sheep throws a rock into a cave, and here's the shattering of pottery. When he goes in to check things out, he discovers these bundles wrapped in cloth and soaked in like an oil. And he sees a bunch of jars sort of strewn around the cave. And when they open these up, they discover that they're complete, intact scrolls. Now, the remarkable thing about the discovery right away, as you point out, most people are interested in the fact that large numbers of these are biblical manuscripts. And in fact, this first one that was taken out by the Ta'amida Bedouin shepherd who found it was the Great Isaiah Scroll, 1Q Isaiah a completely intact copy of the book of Isaiah that scholars have now reliably dated to the end of the 2nd century BCE, maybe the beginning of the 1st century BCE, but remarkable in the fact that it was complete.
It was word for word identical with the Masoretic text. Right?
That's it. That's exactly it. As we've come to learn,
we'll get to that. We'll get to that.
And yes, there's 100 different ways you can validate that statement. Apparently,
an intact version.
And this is the remarkable thing, right? So prior to this time, we had copies of Hebrew Bible texts from the medieval period. The earliest Hebrew manuscripts from which modern Bibles were translated were the Leningrad Codex or the Aleppo Codex, which date to the 10th century CE. So these are properly medieval manuscripts. There's a small handful of other fragmentary Hebrew texts sort of in circulation at the time. One famous one is at the University of Cambridge. It's called the Nash Papyrus. It dates probably to the 1st century BCE. It's a single sheet measuring maybe 20 centimeters by 10 centimeters, and it contains text of the 10 Commandments from both versions, in Exodus and in Deuteronomy, sort of spliced and interspersed together. So that was one of our earliest manuscripts of the Hebrew Bible prior to the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And then there's a smattering of small fragments that you can still go look at. I think at my alma mater, at the University of Manchester, they have a handful of early Hebrew manuscript fragments. And when I say early, I mean, 3rd, 2nd, 1st century CE AD copies of Hebrew Bible texts. So when the Great Isaiah Scroll was discovered suddenly, and I think you have to imagine just how dramatic this was in the moment, where once, and I think maybe I need to set this up a little bit, there was a running scholarly assumption that something that big just could not survive under those conditions in that area, that scholars had given up hope of finding anything like the Dead Sea Scrolls. One of the reasons for this, I think, had to do with something called the Shapiro scrolls, or the Shapiro forgeries, which were purported to be copies of very ancient Bible manuscripts that were being promoted as 6th century BCE. Turns out they're probably fakes. They're lost. They got lost somewhere in the British Library, so they're gone. So we can't check anymore. But at the time they were discovered, near the end of the 19th century, the scholarly consensus, the opinion of almost all experts who looked at them, who actually saw them, said, yeah, these are fakes. And of course they're fakes, because there's just no way anything could survive from that far back for this long under those conditions where they were found. So I think there was that one of the reasons this was such a surprising discovery was because of this prevailing sentiment, at the time of the 40s and the 1950s, when the Great Isaiah Scroll was discovered, and lo and behold, it's a completely intact copy of the book of Isaiah that measures, like 9 meters long. It's a magnificent artifact.
Yeah, you've seen the real thing,
And
right?
I have. I've spent a week of my life working on the real thing inside the vault at the Shrine of the Book in Jerusalem. When people go to see the Dead Sea Scrolls, very often this is the place where they will go. There is a beautiful subterranean exhibit on the property there called the Shrine of the Book, and on display in the rotunda, right in the center of the exhibit, is a replica, an exact replica of the manuscript 1Q Isaiah A, and they will put in and out of circulation smaller fragments from some of the other manuscripts. But nothing is ever on permanent display. And the reason for this is because the worst things for ancient manuscripts are light and humidity, and certainly the changing light and changing humidity. So
Yeah.
we have very tragically also, come to discover over the last 70 years of working on these things just how terribly fragile they are, because the fragments that are still there at the Israel Museum in Jerusalem, uh, even though they are strictly climate controlled and light controlled and guarded, environmentally protected to the best of their ability, they are still falling apart before our very eyes. And yes. So all that to say, yes, I've been inside the vault with the genuine article, with the real thing, where I spent a week working as a PhD student with one of my supervisors and mentors, Peter W. Flint, and Eugene Ulrich, who published the official edition of both 1Q Isaiah A and 1Q Isaiah B.
Yeah, and it's quite astonishing in many ways. I mean, talking about how it's degraded just being in the museum, the fact that it survived for so long, like thousands of years in the desert, is pretty incredible. And it's just so fortunate. It
really is.
The desert conditions just happen to be wonderful for preserving manuscripts, which is why if you want to find ancient manuscripts, biblical manuscripts, you don't go to biblical sites. You go to Egypt, you go to Qumran, because these places just happen to be really good for the preservation of manuscripts. When the
You go
Gospel
where
of
it's
Judas
dark.
was discovered,
You
the
go where it's
apocryphal
dry.
Gospel of Judas
Yes.
was dug up from the desert, and before it got published, there were a bunch of people trying to sell it, and it moved around, and it spent something like 10 years in a safety deposit box in New York City, which almost destroyed it. It's just unfathomable how delicate these things are and how mistreated they often are by people who just don't know what they're doing.
It's true. It's very true. And you know, it's been a learning process for scholars over the course of the last 60 or 70 years of discovery. There's a similar story actually about some of the scrolls in the first discoveries. When 1Q Isaiah A is purported to be the one that was first taken by the Bedouin out of the cave, but they actually took 7 manuscripts in total. These were 1Q Isaiah A, 1Q Isaiah B, a text known as the War Scroll, which in itself is a pretty remarkable apocalyptic telling, somewhat similar to things that you read in the book of Revelation about the battle between the sons of light and the sons of darkness in the last days. And then they found a commentary on the book of Habakkuk, where text from the biblical prophetic book of Habakkuk would be quoted, followed by a contemporary interpretation as to what it means for the people who were living at that time. And then there were rule texts, so-called community rule, which told of regulations for living in this Jewish community, which we believe were the ones responsible for writing and collecting the scrolls. And then another text called the Hodayot, which is a large, rather exquisite collection of poems and songs sounding very similar to things that you read in the book of Psalms, but 100% entirely different. A completely unique poetical composition in the same genre from a later period in time. And then finally, the Genesis Apocryphon, which is an Aramaic text. Not all. It's important for me to point out, not all the texts were written in Hebrew. We have hundreds of manuscripts in the Dead Sea Scrolls which were written in Aramaic, which is really interesting in a couple of regards. And I won't get into it, but it's sort of a fascinating turn on what this collection is and who is putting it together. And it tells us something too about just, you know, Jewish literacy within Jewish Palestine, Greco-Roman Palestine, and the ways people were interacting with their text. So there were these 7 manuscripts which were
And
part
to
of
be
the first
clear,
discovery.
the reason why the Great Isaiah Scroll is called 1Q Isaiah A is it so 1Q refers to the first cave of Qumran, so like
Exactly.
1Q, 1 Qumran, and then it'll be Isa for Isaiah, the name of the text, and then A because it's like the first version. So you'll also have like
And
you've got like I suppose is there a 1Q Isaiah B? I know there's a 4Q
yes,
Isaiah A and a 4Q Isaiah B. There'll be a 1Q Isaiah B, and they all have this kind. So when you see these fancy sort of looking words, it's helpful to that. I think that helps to sort of
yeah,
decode what
that's
you're looking
good.
at there.
Yeah, absolutely. And every manuscript gets both a catalog designation like that, and also a catalog number. So I believe some of the catalog numbers you just never hear. Like I believe 1Q Isaiah A is actually 1Q8 or 7. But again, I don't even know because it's just the
Yeah,
number
but
is
all
not
fancy
something
sounding
that,
terms, but just
yeah,
bear in mind that you're looking at the name of the number of the cave, and then the kind of the text
correct.
that we're
And
that we're dealing with here.
there were 11 caves, right? And there were manuscripts discovered in 10 of the 11 caves. There were no manuscripts discovered in cave 10 itself. So that's where the numbers come from. So all of these ones from the first discoveries are 1Q manuscripts. So 1Q Isaiah A, 1Q Pesher Habakkuk, which is the way we talk about a commentary. And then 1Q M, which is the shortened form for the milchama, is the Hebrew word for war. And then 1QH, which is short for chorayot, the Hebrew word for praises, for the so-called Thanksgiving hymns, that sort of thing. So there were these 7 manuscripts that were discovered at first. Um, they the Bedouin who found them held on to them for some time, and originally also struggled to find someone interested in buying them. In Bethlehem, they circulated them among antiquities dealers and, people in merchants working in the markets and not getting much traction. They were eventually sold to 4 of them were eventually sold to an antiquities dealer and a cobbler in Bethlehem by the name of Iskander Shahin. He's more commonly known as Kando, and he ended up being basically the broker for sales of manuscript fragments that the Bedouin continued to find in the desert and the archaeologists who worked on the text. But from this first discovery, he purchased 4. The remaining 3 were handed off to a friend of his by the name of George Assay. And George Assay also was in contact with a professor at the Hebrew University by the name of Eliezer Sukenik, a professor of archaeology, who was one of the first scholars to see the Dead Sea Scrolls and was so excited about what he saw that he, with some doing, managed to secure some money from the Hebrew University to purchase. He wanted to purchase all of them, but only had the opportunity to purchase the other 3 that weren't already bought by Kando. Now, so the first 7 ended up being split up right away. 3 of them ended up at the Hebrew University. The remaining 4, Kando then, he was brokering this sale with a Syrian Orthodox priest by the name of, shoot, what's his name? Sorry, Athanasius Samuel. So, the 4 ended up with the Syrian Orthodox priest, Athanasius Samuel, and this all happened as well in 1947. So, at the same time, the Second World had ended a few years before. There was a strong movement afoot for an independent state of Israel. There was a lot of tension in the city of Jerusalem and certainly in the region. And in November of 1947, the state of Israel was officially declared and ratified by the United Nations. The British mandate had come to an end, and many people who were living in the region packed up and left, in large part just because of increased political tension and things that were going on um, in the rest of the world. And Athanasius Samuel packed his stuff up, including his 4 scrolls, and went to the United States. And there's some very good um, old video recordings of some of the manuscripts, some of the scrolls themselves, and a number of these actually come from places like the Library of Congress or from Johns Hopkins University, where Athanasius Samuel was on a months long tour of the US with his 4 manuscripts, attempting to find a buyer, and unsuccessfully so at that. And the reason for this was because with the recent establishment of the state of Israel, there was growing concern that, this new state of Israel would then just nationalize everything that ended up on the market, and in so doing, basically annex it and take it back, into their own custody. So, this for 2 years, Athanasius Samuel wandered around, without able to find any buyers, for these 4 fabulous manuscripts that he had. He famously took out an advertisement in the classifieds of the Wall Street Journal. The heading on it is 4 Dead Sea Scrolls for sale, and the body of the text says, "These would make a wonderful gift for an academic institution or for a religious institution of some sort." So there is this ongoing. I think this just this is kind of the nature of working with antiquities and with material culture of all sorts. And a lot of this is just because this is such sensitive material with such wide ranging implications, religious implications, but also political implications as well. Most of it ends up going underground and passing through shady antiquities dealers or places like that before ever seeing the light of day. But yeah, the scrolls
Man,
are no
it's a hell of
exception
a
in that
story. I
regard.
mean, it's always the case with these manuscripts, discoveries, and transportations. It's shocking and weird and incredible, but eventually, these manuscripts are translated. You can read them online. Like, we know what's inside them, and they've been studied to a pretty extensive degree. But people might sort of forget that 1947 isn't that long ago. If you compare it to New Testament studies, which, even at that time, even in the 40s, New Testament studies was small enough that, like, there's nothing like the kind of materials even that we have today. People have been studying these texts for
Thousands
incalculably
of years.
longer than
Yes.
and so although a lot of study has been done into the Dead Sea Scrolls, there's still so much being done, and some cutting edge stuff that you've been telling me about, which we'll get into, that's incredibly interesting. But the thing about, like, looking at the Isaiah scroll is that Christians, Jews, they discover the 1Q Isaiah A, and they all sort of go, phew, like, okay, thank goodness, because they could have unearthed a text that was completely different to the version that we have today, and it would have really upset the idea that the Bible is the inspired word of God. But luckily, with some variants, the text was almost identical, and so told us something important about the preservation of biblical texts, and gave us an indication into the care that is taken in preserving this story of the book of Isaiah, right?
Yeah, but I think too, on you raise a couple of important issues with that observation, Alex. On the one hand, I think it's worth mentioning here. I talked just very briefly about these Shapira forgeries from the late 19th century, which kind of affected scholarly opinions about what's even possible, right? One of, I think, the motivating factors in terms of how scholars approached those particular manuscripts is in that these did not match up identically with the biblical text. In this case, the biblical text of Deuteronomy. One of the things that we know about these transcriptions of these forgeries is that they presented an elaborately different version of the book of Deuteronomy, and one that, confirms or aligns with scholarly views about the composition of the book of Deuteronomy from, the 6th century, the 7th century, and as a text that developed over time. I think this has an effect on the way that scholars even will handle these materials. The excitement and the attention that the Dead Sea Scrolls gained at their discovery was very much fueled by these questions. What does this do for our for whatever it is we know about the text of the Bible? How does this affect what we think we know about early Christianity? Even and
Yes, because of course this time the Dead Sea Scrolls are written, broadly speaking. I mean, it's a few hundred years, but it roughly coincides with the time of Christ. So although it doesn't say anything about Jesus, there's no New Testament manuscripts or anything like that. What we do have is an indication of the kind of things that Jews believed at the time that Jesus was alive, which or just before Jesus came, which is incredibly useful of its own accord, even if we don't have any Christian literature among the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Very much so. In fact, this is one of the directions. I mean, there's a number of things that we could talk about in terms of how the Dead Sea Scrolls have affected biblical scholarship more generally, and it just in a few ways. They've not just been extremely valuable for increasing our understanding of the text of the Bible at this period of time. They provided a window into Jewish culture at the time of Jesus, or leading up to the time of Jesus and the emergence of the church. And this has been, in large part, a surprise. The Dead Sea Scrolls over the course of the last 60 or 70 years have really had a significant effect in overturning and revolutionizing our understanding of the shape of early Judaism in some pretty exciting and some really interesting ways. Most of the first scholars, I should correct myself. All of the first scholars who saw, handled, and worked with the Dead Sea Scrolls in the 1940s and the 50s were Christians. They were not Jewish. And this also had a major effect on the ways in which, certainly in the early days, the scrolls were organized or collected and interpreted. For example, the scrolls were housed and kept basically and studied at the École Biblique, which is the Dominican French school of archaeology in East Jerusalem. And most of the members of the editorial team in the beginning were Dominican priests. So when they would read a lot of the non-biblical literature, a lot of the literature that was produced by this community in the early days, and when you read some of the early material that they wrote, it felt like they were writing about, an ascetic religious sect, very much like the Dominicans. Go figure. It's something we all have a tendency to read our own narratives into these things. I think this is what you see coming from Christian apologists as well when it comes to the question of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and something that I am constantly eager to encounter and correct in terms of the ways in which they want to evaluate the text are relative to this question of how reliable or how close is our Bible to the ancient Bible. It's the primary question, the priority question that they always ask with regards to the scrolls. But even in just asking that question does not provide a clear enough or a comprehensive enough answer or perspective on what this discovery is and the very many ways in which these manuscripts are really valuable for increasing our understanding of this part of the world at this particular point in time.
So, who do we think wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls? You talked about when they're from, but what kind of Jews are sitting down and putting these manuscripts together?
So, yes. So we know from the first century Jewish historian Flavius Josephus, as well as another first century writer, Philo of Alexandria, of different competing sects of Judaism in and around this time. We know of the Sadducees or the Sadducites, who were part of the Jewish aristocracy and in charge of the temple. We know of the Pharisees, and you'll recognize these groups also from the New Testament, who were more of a widespread populist group of Jews that probably emerged out of the question of how to do Judaism without being part of the temple ritual on a regular basis. But this was really a reformative movement in an effort to make Judaism as practical and as I'll just say as practical and pragmatic just within the Hellenistic Roman world. So we know of these groups. We also know of another group called the Essenes. And both Josephus and Philo tell us that the Essenes lived in various places in and around the region, but were particularly concentrated on the western shore of the Dead Sea. Excuse me. They go on to tell us about some of their beliefs and their practices. They identify them as sort of a secret sect, not interested in interacting or spreading the gospel among their fellow men. They kept to themselves. They were extremely concerned with matters of ritual purity and had a very strict approach to the observance of the rules of the Torah, certainly much more strict than that of the Pharisees. So, based on the types of literature that we've discovered within the Dead Sea Scrolls, which seem to be self-identifying, where the writers are speaking of their own community, these tend to align with things that Josephus and Philo tell us about the Essenes. And that, coupled with the geographical identification, has most scholars convinced that they were produced by a group of the Essenes or by a group that was very similar
Right.
to the Essenes.
Sure. Okay, so we've got the Essenes, as many scholars believe, writing these texts in sort of over this 300-ish year period around the time of the turn of the millennium. And so we end up having these biblical texts. We've talked about the Isaiah scroll, which, as we said, is pretty darn similar to the Isaiah that we have in the Masoretic text in the Old Testament that we have in the Bible today. Not word for word, no. But pretty close, let's say. But that's not the only Old Testament text that we have. It's the only complete one, I think. But we have other sort of quite large chunks of other texts which aren't quite as don't quite have the same accuracy,
cachet, right? Or even accuracy. Yeah. So this is really something that I get worked up about just in my own profession, in my own work. So one of the things that you commonly hear from Christian apologists in particular is this remarkable level of correspondence that you see between texts of the Bible from the Dead Sea Scrolls with copies of the Masoretic text, and this is the text type, the standard text of the Hebrew Bible that survived into the medieval period. And for some reason, lots of Christians are really worked up about the text aligning with the Masoretic text in particular, which is kind of funny, because one of the things that we know, we knew this already, that there were competing versions of Old Testament texts in circulation at the time of Jesus.
How do we
One
know
of the
that?
reasons we know this.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, I was
was
going
gonna
to
say
ask
one
how
of
we know that. Yeah.
Yeah, one of the reasons we know this is because, in the first place, wherever New Testament authors are quoting the Bible, they're always quoting from the Greek translation, or almost always quoting from the Greek translation of the of the Old Testament, of the Hebrew Bible. But there are a number of places where it clearly doesn't match up there either. And then we also have this Greek translation of the Old Testament, which probably dates back to the 3rd century BCE, or at least the Torah portion, the part of the Pentateuch. But in many places, this document called the Septuagint does not, and actually pretty dramatically departs from, the Hebrew text that we know from this medieval Masoretic text. So we already knew about some of this textual pluriformity. There's another version of certainly the Pentateuch that survives, the Torah, called the Samaritan Pentateuch, which is still in use by the tiny surviving community of Samaritan Jews still out on Mount Gerizim in the northern part of the country. So we already knew about the existence of some of this stuff, and it shouldn't come as any surprise to know that among the hundreds of so-called biblical manuscripts that we find in the Dead Sea Scrolls, you see quite a bit of representation, not just of something that looks like the Masoretic text. And I think it's important to point out that when you go back this far with text this old, prior to the establishment of the sorts of scribal conventions that led to a stronger sense of preservation, which all happened later, you go back this far, you will discover that there are no two manuscripts that look exactly the same. No two copies of the same text from the Dead Sea Scrolls looks exactly the same. They are all a little different, but some of them are pretty remarkably different from one another. As an example, in mentioning the Septuagint, one of the features of the Septuagint is the book of Jeremiah, which we know in two pretty dramatically different versions. The one that survives in the Masoretic text in the Hebrew.
Oh, and what is the Masoretic text? Just quickly.
Oh, so
for
yeah,
people
so this
listening.
is the standard text of the Hebrew Bible that has survived into the medieval period, on which all of our English translations, or most of our English translations of the Old Testament, are based. And this is the one that we know from those 10th century codices, the Leningrad Codex and the Aleppo Codex. So we did find examples of texts that look very close to the Masoretic text in the Dead Sea Scrolls. So yes, we've got those, but we've got all these other things too.
So Jeremiah, you were talking about.
So Jeremiah is in the Hebrew text. It is 13% longer than the Greek translation of the book of Jeremiah from the Septuagint, and it's in a dramatically different order. Like chunks and entire chapters and huge sections of text have just been jumbled around and tossed about in a completely different structure. Prior to the discovery of the scrolls, scholars already knew, as scholars were convinced that there was pretty significant development just within this single composition. Scholars were convinced that the Septuagint version, the Greek translation, was translated from an older Hebrew version, and that what we have in the Masoretic text is actually a dramatically revised, updated Hebrew version. And one of the things that we discovered in the Dead Sea Scrolls was 6 copies of the book of Jeremiah, 2 of which look pretty close to the Masoretic text in terms of their text type, at least. That's the, the language and the alignment. Maybe not in terms of structure, which is another question. But then 2 of the manuscripts look actually very, very close in terms of both the text and the structure to the Greek translation that we know in the Septuagint. So the natural conclusion of scholars is that among the Dead Sea Scrolls, you have both of these competing versions in circulation at the same time being used by this same group of people. And there's even while we're talking about Jeremiah, I'll just mention one more thing. I've worked fairly extensively with a particular manuscript, 4Q Jeremiah A. So you'll recognize that as coming from K4 at Qumran, and this is the first copy of the book of Jeremiah from K4. It also happens to be one of the oldest of the Dead Sea Scrolls, making it one of our oldest biblical manuscripts anywhere. It dates to probably the end of the 2nd century. Probably the end of the 3rd century BCE. And within this particular manuscript, there is a section between chapter 7 and chapter 8 where the scribe, he's writing along, and he comes to the end of Jeremiah chapter 7:28, and he ends his paragraph and leaves an open line to the end of the column, and then goes to the next line to start a new paragraph. But instead of starting with verse 29, he starts with chapter 8, verse 5, and then continues in his writing. Now, somebody else came along after probably 100 years of this manuscript being in circulation, and we can tell this on the basis of analyzing handwriting styles, which is one of the ways in which is the way we commonly date the manuscripts. So by analyzing the handwriting styles, I can see that another scribe has come along after decades, maybe 100 years, and inserted into the margin, into the blank paragraph space, 3 lines, and then he's run out of space, so he actually has to go and write along the edge of the column, the column break in between the 2 columns. He writes another 4 lines, but still hasn't completed his text, so he turns the whole thing like right upside down, and then just finishes his text upside down in the bottom margin. Now, the remarkable thing about this is that even prior to the discovery of this particular manuscript, there was some suggestion by scholars that this section between Jeremiah chapter 7:29, or sorry, Jeremiah chapter 7 verse 28 and chapter 8 verse 5 was probably a secondary addition by a later writer working in the text of Jeremiah. And now we have a manuscript in our possession where you can see this happening. I hesitate to say real time, just because we're dealing with artifacts that are thousands of years old. But we're certainly looking at a situation where this was not a native part of this particular manuscript of Jeremiah. And this is the kind of thing, this is for my perspective as a biblical scholar, as a textual critic, as a scribal specialist, as someone who's keenly interested in questions with regards to the composition and the shape and the reception of the biblical text through time. This is all intensely interesting to me, and this is the kind of thing that we see all over the place in the Dead Sea Scrolls. We see active scribal involvement in the texts of the Bible in such a way that, quite frankly, is fairly surprising. It was fairly surprising to scholars when they started to dig in to the texts of the Bible, just how active scribes were in the authorial process and the transmission process of these texts.
Yes, and that also potentially shows up in the Great Isaiah Scroll.
It does.
Evidence of scribal notation, as it were, that might tell us something interesting about Isaiah. Now, especially given that the Isaiah Scroll is celebrated as giving us an insight into the text's preservation, there is a fascinating line of thought about the book of Isaiah that it is not written by one author. It's not written by one guy called Isaiah, but instead is made up of multiple authors kind of put together under the name of Isaiah. For a long time, scholars had separated like the first writer and the second writer. There is some thought that it's split into 3 parts as well, and there's some dispute over exactly where that split occurs. But one way of splitting up the book of Isaiah thematically is up to verse 33, and then from verse 34 onwards. And there's sort of a thematic break, and everything sort of changes. And so there was some idea that there's actually 2 different texts being written here. So before looking at the manuscript evidence, like, do we have good reason outside of that to already suspect this multiple authorship, and where does that idea come from?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is an idea that's already hundreds of years old. This is based on observations by scholars and specialists back in the 19th century with regards to Isaiah. So there are 66 chapters in the book of Isaiah, and early on, scholars noted that in the first place, Isaiah himself, Isaiah the prophet, is mentioned. So there's a couple of narrative sections in the book of Isaiah. In chapter 6, there's the story of his call, right? His call to be a prophet of Yahweh. He's in the temple worshiping. He sees a vision of God and has his lips seared by burning hot coals. It's a lovely story. And then in chapters 36 through 39 is a large narrative chunk that is actually almost identical. There are some clear differences, but there's an obvious relationship, an obvious close correspondence between this story of Isaiah and the King Hezekiah and the invading Assyrians with stuff that we read from 2 Kings. So I don't know the scholarly discussion enough to know which direction scholars tend to think this is going, whether the older text is in Isaiah or in 2 Kings. But in any event, this is something that is known outside of the book of Isaiah. So that's chapters 36 through 39. Now, in all the rest of the stuff, like in all the prophecies themselves, Isaiah's name pops up only 6 times. And all of those instances happen to be in this first half, before the narrative section in chapter 36 starts. So everything from chapter 1 through chapter 35, this is where you find these 6 mentions of the prophet's name. He is never mentioned after that at any point. So this was a clue right away to scholars. But the really big one, some of the important information that they looked at carefully was just how dramatically different this second half of Isaiah was. Within the first half, within these first 35 chapters, 35 chapters or so, the nature of Isaiah's language, his concerns, his message, many of the themes were really focused on the events of the 8th century, the impending invasion of Assyria, the so-called Syro-Ephraimite War prior to that. These were primary concerns in this part of the book. And then there's a dramatic shift in chapter 40. The tone changes. We're introduced now to a different type of literature, which we more readily identify or recognize as the servant songs. It's this high level poetic kind of literature, and these texts seem much more naturally set at a time when there is no temple. One of the key features in this part of the book is that the author is pining and bemoaning the fact that there's no temple in Jerusalem, which seems strange if it's being written by Isaiah the prophet back in the 8th century. So this is a clue right away to scholars. And then in chapter 42, one of the prophecies makes mention by name of Cyrus the Great. Yahweh calls Cyrus my Messiah, who's coming to basically take the Jewish people back and rebuild the temple in Jerusalem. Now, Cyrus the Great lived in the 6th century BCE. So either this is a remarkable piece of evidence for the fulfillment of an actual datable prophecy to the 8th century, fulfilled some 200 years in the future, or we're dealing with a different kind of text written at a different point in time. And this is through the accumulation of pieces of evidence like this, checking and noting just some of the vocabulary and the sentence structure differences between these two parts of this book. Scholars have quite unanimously concluded that this is precisely what we're dealing with. We're dealing with a core set of oracles belonging to Isaiah ben Amoz, who lived in the 8th century, or maybe some of his followers that were collected together and forming this core in Isaiah chapter 1 through 33, 34, 35. There's some speculation about that, followed by this narrative section in chapter 36 to 39. But then at some point later in time, additional prophecies were added on to this manuscript in the form of these songs and oracles from a later period of time during the Babylonian exile, after the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem in 587 BCE. Somebody, who probably was a follower of the teachings of Isaiah and a big fan of the writings of Isaiah, probably took his Isaiah scroll and started adding things to it. We're not entirely sure when these things take place, but there's definitely some level of inspiration or influence from the first half to the second half, but a clear enough distinction between the two that have convinced us that we're dealing with two separate compositions. And we actually have, I'll just say one more thing about this. We actually have an analog for how this works in another collection of texts from the Hebrew Bible. What we know of as the minor prophets, these are the small prophetic books that appear after Ezekiel. That includes Hosea, Amos, Joel, Nahum, Micah, Habakkuk, on and on. There's 12 of them. We see within Jewish collections of these texts, within Jewish Bibles, that the 12 prophets, the so-called minor prophets, appear to have always been collected together as a single group. And in fact, when it comes to the Dead Sea Scrolls, this is what we see. There are copies of manuscripts of the 12 prophets from Masada, from Mutabat, from Qumran. And the one thing they all seem to have in common is that all of these individual shorter compositions of prophets were collected together on the same manuscript. There's some really interesting differences between the individual copies of these books, but this is an example of how something like this can happen, where people were developing and people were writing anthologies, not just books belonging to a single author, but books based on individual themes or ideas or theological principles that they would collect together on the same scroll. And this seems to be what happened with the text of Isaiah. This anonymous collection of songs and poems written after the destruction of Jerusalem during the exile came to be collected along with the book of Isaiah proper from the 8th
and then get
century
merged
BCE.
into one text at some point.
Yes.
So
at some
what
point.
is the manuscript evidence from the Dead Sea Scrolls that we're dealing with two authors or two texts under the umbrella of the book of Isaiah here?
So it's really substantive. I'll say that at the outset. There is a ton of data, and I'll go through all of it here, which shows that even by the 2nd or 1st century BCE, there was an awareness of the existence of these two compositions, of a first Isaiah and at least a second Isaiah. And we see this right within the Great Isaiah Scroll itself. You alluded to it within the manuscript, right in the center at the end of column 27 is the end of chapter 33, Isaiah chapter 33. And at the end of the column, at the very bottom, the scribe has left 3 empty lines of text. There's nothing there. It's blank. And he started chapter 34 at the top of the following column. Importantly, this break also happens at the end of a sheet. When it comes to large scrolls, Alex, the way that they're made is the animal is slaughtered, skinned, the skin is scraped and prepared, and then they are ruled in columns and lines. A scribe comes and writes on them. And if it's a particularly large manuscript, they will stitch several of these sheets, these individual sheets together to complete the whole thing. So importantly, this break also appears at the end of a sheet. Now, this is something that the casual observer is going to miss. But it's also something that scholars have known about and recognized from the very beginning. William Brownlee, who was my own PhD supervisor's PhD supervisor, writing about this manuscript in the 1950s, was already talking about what he called the bisection in 1Q Isaiah A, this break between chapter 33 and chapter 34. He wrote a couple of articles about this.
We'll put this
already
on screen
back
for
in the
people to
1950s.
see, because it's like it's the kind of thing, as you say, for the casual reader, it kind of looks kind of natural because you're already near the bottom of the page and it's a small gap. It's like 3 lines, maybe 2. It's probably 3. It's sort of 2 or 3. isn't this just the kind of thing that, like, he got near the bottom of the page and thought, it's a new sentence, or so. I'm going to start on the
But
next
this
page.
is this is the thing, right? It's not.
Mhm.
And we have an accumulation of manuscript evidence from the time period, from different sites, which demonstrates this. This is the significant thing about this break, is that the only time this ever occurs in any manuscript, any Second Temple manuscript, this is a manuscript from the same time period, these Jewish manuscripts, any time that this kind of a multi-line break appears, it always only means the same thing, and that is that the scribe is moving on from the end of one composition to the beginning of the other. So we see breaks like this. They're rare, but where we do see them, they always occur at the ends of books and the starts of new books. So, for example, we have a couple of manuscripts of the Torah, or at least a couple books from the Torah, from the Pentateuch, where you will see the last verse of the book of Genesis, followed by 3 empty lines, and then the first verse at the beginning of Exodus. Or you will see the last verse of the book of Leviticus, followed by 3 empty lines, and the beginning of the first verse from the book of Numbers. So we already have an established pattern here for what this means. I mentioned the minor prophet scrolls earlier. They don't even leave multi-line breaks. The breaks between the individual prophets in a number of these minor prophet scrolls is just a single line. So if this is what this break means everywhere else, then we should take that seriously and understand that that's probably what this means here. This probably means that this is the end of First Isaiah in the mind of this scribe, and that the top of at the beginning of chapter 34 is the beginning of a new composition. So that's the break, but there's a lot more to it.
Well, this is interesting, right? If it's just the break, I remember when you first told me about this,
Yeah.
and I thought, that's cool. That's really interesting. Like, some indication, manuscript evidence of this, of this break. Now, importantly, prior to this, scholars had discussed the idea of there being 2 or maybe 3 Isaiahs: the Proto-Isaiah, the Deutero-Isaiah, and possibly the Trito-Isaiah. And the breakup there is slightly different, because they often have first Isaiah, Proto-Isaiah, ending at verse 39, and with Deutero-Isaiah beginning with verse 40. So you might expect that if there was this gap, it would appear between 39 and 40. But since the 20th century, people have theorized otherwise. They've looked, for example, at the themes. So verses 1 to chapters 1 to 33 consist of warnings about judgments that are going to happen, promises of things that will happen to Jerusalem, speaking about it in the future tense, whereas chapters 34 onwards seem to assume that judgment has already taken place. The restoration of Jerusalem is already happening. So there's this thematic break that seems to coincide with this textual break as well.
So yeah, exactly. And I think people like in terms of gaining a clearer understanding of this too, like, while most scholars will tell you just in simple terms that First Isaiah is chapters 1 through 39, let's remember as well that those last 3 chapters 36 through 39, this is the narrative section that looks like it was just pulled out of a different text altogether. So what do you do with that? That looks like it's probably something that was added on at one point in time. But even before the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and certainly since the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, there has been quite a bit of discussion among scholars about chapters 34 and 35 already being later inserted into the text at some point later in time. So there was already some thought among scholars prior to this discovery that the developmental history of this text was quite a bit more complicated than the simple lines in which we have chosen to draw it up in. So, but this is, it's to my eye a clear indication that at least scholars are on the right track when it
Right.
comes to tracking the development of these things. And I mean, if it was just that, I mean, that would be enough for me. But there's a lot more to this as well.
Yeah, well, so I want to talk about some of the further evidence, because another thing that people will point to is the fact that Isaiah is 66 chapters long. This break occurs after verse 33, which is exactly halfway through the text. Now, it may be that there are just two texts that happen to have the same number of chapters, that this gap indicates the end of one and the beginning of the next, but is it a bit suspicious that it occurs exactly halfway through, as if to say that there might be something special about the two halves of Isaiah? It seems, unlikely that you would just happen to have two texts with the same number of chapters. It seems more like this is a unified text, and for some reason it's been sort of split down right at the middle. Do you find anything suspicious in that placement, bang on in the middle of the book?
So I tend to view that differently. To me, this looks like the natural way that a scribe would be reconstructing his text. One of the things that we know about scribes and readers and writers from antiquity is that they really enjoyed looking for these sorts of patterns of correspondence. So it seems like a natural move for a scribe who already has the existence of these two texts that are coming together, that he's going to go, well, this first, he's going to look for those points of harmony, I think, or those points of parallel between the two. So I would say I tend to look at this as just a feature, a natural feature of scribal development that we also know from other sorts of compositions. You see the same sort of thing happening in something like the Book of Psalms, which has been compiled together from like large numbers of different types of collections, but put together in such a way as to provide some structural harmony to the whole thing. So that's that. I tend to look at this as a feature of scribal development in terms of improving the structural harmony of this new thing that we now call this larger composition of Isaiah. Does that make sense?
Yes, but so people will be listening to this and they might be not convinced by that. They might say, I still find that incredibly suspicious. So the only evidence that you have, Dr. Davis, is that there are two authors going on here, is that there's this 3-line gap, which there could be hundreds of explanations for that. So as you've alluded to, I will ask you a question I know the answer to. Are there other reasons to think that these two sections of Isaiah are written by different authors?
There are, in fact, several. And I'll go through these last ones a little bit more quickly. So, in the second half of Isaiah, from the Great Isaiah Scroll, we know that this particular part of the text, this particular manuscript, was copied from a different copy than the first half. So the scroll who wrote the first half of Isaiah chapters 1 through 33, in the Great Isaiah Scroll, had a copy of Isaiah before him that he was, transcribing onto his new document. The scribe who the second half of this manuscript, chapters 34 through 66, was copied from a separate manuscript. And the reason we know that is because there's some unusual features within just the second half, where there is a repeating pattern of breaks in the text, with secondary scribal insertions. And there's been some work done by a Dead Sea Scroll scholar named Drew Longaker. He wrote an article back in 2014 where he argued quite convincingly that you can actually, map this out for the entire manuscript and demonstrate that the copy that the scribe was using for this second half of Isaiah was actually damaged at the bottom. So he was missing 1 or 2, maybe 3 lines of text at the bottom of every column of his manuscript that he was trying to copy. And he would encounter a place where he get to the bottom, damage part of the manuscript, and usually wasn't confident about what was there, didn't know what was there, so he decided just to leave an empty space, and resolve to come back and fill it in at a later point in time, or maybe somebody else will come back and fill in the missing text. But sometimes there's a few places where he feels pretty sure about what he knows the text is and goes ahead and just kind of freehands it. He writes in what he remembers or what he thinks the missing text must be, but every single time it's a little different. It's a clear paraphrase. So if you put these things, you add them all up and you put it together, it's pretty obvious that the scroll was different for this second half of this book. And
So
in
we're looking at
addition to
somebody
that,
who's got this manuscript that's damaged at the bottom, and occasionally it looks like they filled it in such a way that shows they knew what the text was, but they didn't actually
Yes.
have it in front of them because it's not like
Yeah.
quite right. It's like, oh, what's that Bible verse about? Like the cat. It's easier for a rich man to part. Yeah, I know. And you sort of write it out from what you remember, and it's close enough, but you're doing it from memory.
yes, just like that. So and it's important to point like to emphasize that this is a repeating pattern, right? So you can actually
Right.
track it with math. You can measure the distance between where each one of these instances occurs, and you end up with it happening basically in the same point as you're going through the entire manuscript. But this raises a question for us in the first place. I think, why on earth, if the book of Isaiah is a complete, intact 66 chapter composition at the time that this manuscript is being prepared and written, why on earth would a scribe need to use a different copy for the second half? The obvious answer, I think, is because this is how the text was known at this time, that it existed in these two halves. But in addition to that, I think I mentioned to you ahead of the show that I attended a virtual conference or a virtual lecture yesterday at the Oriel College at the University of Oxford. I'm sure you're familiar with it.
I've heard of it.
Yeah. So every year they host the Charles Knapp Lecture, and this year the presenters were Milan Popovic and Maruf Dali from the University of Groningen, who a number of years ago ran a very exciting ERC project called The Hands That Wrote the Bible, where they developed machine learning tools to help investigate scripts in the Dead Sea Scrolls in an effort to identify individual scribal hands and to improve our efforts toward dating and identifying manuscripts using paleography. Now, they spent a lot of time working on this particular manuscript, 1Q Isaiah A, because of course they did. It's intact. It's, in terms of a data set, it's probably the biggest individual one And while to the naked eye, when you look at the two halves of 1Q Isaiah A, even to the naked eye of specialists in this field, the two hands look the same. It looks like it was the same scribe who wrote both the first half and the second half of this manuscript. When in actual fact, we have discovered, or I should say, Popovich and Dolly have discovered through their through the tools that they've developed, that the second half was not only copied from a different exemplar, a different manuscript, it was also copied by a different scribe altogether. It's an exciting project overall because it's an excellent demonstration of the interdisciplinary work between scientists and technologists and antiquities specialists. But it's very exciting. And I'll mention one other thing about this manuscript, something that we observed. I worked on the official publication of 1Q Isaiah A and 1Q Isaiah B a number of years ago. And one of the things that we were doing when we were working on 1Q Isaiah A was looking at these early parts of the manuscript in the first half where the individual sheets appeared to have folds in them. Now, the intriguing thing is that this only appears in the first half of the manuscript. At the time when the volume eventually came to be published, we weren't entirely sure what to do with this feature. In the intervening time, scholars have worked on this more in earnest, and it have come to discover basically that at one point in time, this first half, first Isaiah, chapters 1 to 33 of 1Q Isaiah A, was actually, detached entirely from the second half and stored in a folded position as opposed to a rolled position. And this is different from the second half, which was rolled. And it looks as though this is something that was happening for a while before these two halves were even put together. So there you have the break.
Wow.
At the end of chapter 33. You have the two manuscripts having been copied from separate exemplars. You have the two manuscripts having been copied by by two separate scribes. You have the two manuscripts having been stored differently for a period of time before they were combined. And then you also have what appears to be a different textual alignment in the first half as compared to the second half. So we talked a little bit about variation in 1Q Isaiah A, right? And there's the 2600 textual variants that the editors have counted in 1Q Isaiah A. And most people compare these to the Masoretic text. One of the other things that appears to be the case, and I don't think the legwork on this has actually been done, but scholars have started to really notice that the first half of 1Q Isaiah A does not align as closely to the Masoretic text as the second half of 1Q Isaiah A. So you have all of these data points, and then I'll give you the one more that doesn't get talked about enough that I get really excited about. At this point, we start talking about what is happening with the book of Isaiah in the rest of the collection of the Dead Sea Scrolls. There are 21 copies in total of text from the book of Isaiah in the Dead Sea Scrolls. The vast majority of these come from Cave 4. We have 2 from Cave 1 and 1 from Cave 5. Now, the two from Cave 1, we know, 1Q Isaiah A, 1Q Isaiah B. There are two more copies from Cave 4, 4Q Isaiah A and 4Q Isaiah C. I believe that's right. Both of these appear to have been at one time complete copies of all of Isaiah from chapter 1 through to chapter 66. Just like 1Q Isaiah A, just like 1Q Isaiah B. And we know this because even though they're fragmentary, they preserve material from every single part of the book of Isaiah, from all of these many different sections. But what's really interesting is looking at the remaining 17 copies of the book of Isaiah from the Dead Sea Scrolls. And what we discover is that among these, each individual manuscript contained only text from the first half of Isaiah, Isaiah chapters 1 through 33, or the second half of Isaiah, chapters 34 through 66. And this is across the board. 17 manuscripts, 9 preserving text from only the first part of Isaiah, another 8 preserving text from only the second part of Isaiah. Like that's, I mean, my math's not great, but that's, I believe that's 80% of all the text of Isaiah that we have from the Dead Sea Scrolls attest to this one feature, that these appear to have been separate compositions in the 2nd and 1st century BCE and were not combined together, at least not universally combined together.
My question is, in the face of all of this, what is the scholarly reaction? Maybe you don't know because some of this is quite recent, but like, are scholars looking at this?
Brownlee
and going,
was writing about this in the 50s. So
sure. But I mean, the
some of
recent
it,
stuff,
you're
like
right,
with
but-
the machine learning and all
Yes,
this kind
yes.
of stuff. But like, yeah, we're looking at this and seeing all these data points. Are scholars looking at this and going like, okay, yeah, that's pretty conclusive, or is there dispute? Are people, because I can tell your level of confidence, and I'm trying to figure out if that is unique to you and scholars like you, or if that is just the conclusion that scholars are naturally led to.
This is as near as I can tell in the literature that has been published over the course of the last 10 or 15 years in critical journals and volumes. This is the accepted fact that and most of this stuff is just stuff written about 1Q Isaiah A. Far and away, scholars tend to posit and conclude that this is the way Isaiah was still being circulated in the 1st century BCE, very often in 2 separate compositions. Not always, but very often in 2 separate compositions. It's a developmental process, right? So it doesn't all happen all at once. It's something that's still taking place. But there appears to be a sense among the people who are writing and collecting these manuscripts that there's something definitely distinct about these two, essentially these 2 biblical books.
Now, am I right in thinking that there is some history of forgery in the story of the Dead Sea Scrolls?
Yeah, absolutely. It's more recent, but I'd be remiss to not point out that with the first discoveries, this question was already being raised. So, one of the first of the editors of the Dead Sea Scrolls published his journal entries in one of the volumes from 1953 when he was working on the digs at Mutabat. This is another site where manuscripts have been discovered. in which he tells of some of the Bedouin trying to sell him what he already recognized to be obvious forgeries. He noted that they had bits of there were bits of leather, and they had Hebrew letters on them, but most of them were kind of nonsensical. Couldn't make heads or tails of what was on them. So this was already happening back in the 1950s. And then another scholar by the name of Solomon Zeitlin was the editor of the Jewish Quarterly Review, which is an academic journal, but he kind of ran it like his own little fiefdom, and went on a 15 or 20-year campaign starting in the 1940s and carried through all the way until his passing, attempting to argue that all the Dead Sea Scrolls were forgeries. We have this is in fact not the case, and we're confident about this in large part because even though most of the manuscript were discovered by non-specialists, by non-professionals, not in controlled archaeological digs, importantly, there were proper archaeological excavations in all 11 of the Qumran caves and at the other sites where manuscripts were discovered. And one of the things that people don't notice or don't know is that the archaeologists who dug and in the caves found fragments, small fragments of manuscripts still there, and we've been able to match those to manuscripts that the Bedouin had actually brought in and sold. And in addition to that, these have been carbon dated. They have been DNA tested, which identifies, the types of animals that were used in their construction. There is just a variety of ways in which we have managed to confirm at least the fact that these are authentic ancient Jewish manuscripts. Some of the inks themselves from the manuscripts have been tested and reveal the same sort of thing. So that's to start. Now, starting around 1996, a private collector by the name of Martin Skoyan started to raise questions. He started to make inquiries about the possibility of buying fragments of Dead Sea Scrolls for his own private collection. When he approached you remember I mentioned the original antiquities dealer who handled most of this material, named Kando, was still alive. Sorry, this was back in 1993. Still alive back in 1993. Skoyan actually approached him about the possibility of buying any scrolls fragments, and Kando responded to him and said, "Those days are gone." He said, "It's over." And then the next year, he passed away. But in the intervening time, over the course of the next 5 or 6 years, Martin Skoyan was able to purchase fragments of what he was told were Dead Sea Scrolls directly from Kando's heirs in Jerusalem and Bethlehem, and from other antiquities dealers. They started circulating fragments purported to be from Dead Sea Scrolls in the United States, and many of these were sold to evangelical Christian institutions like Azusa Pacific University. Purchased 5 fragments for their special collections. Southwestern Baptist Seminary in Texas. I'm pretty sure it's in Texas. Yes. Southwestern Baptist Seminary in Texas purchased 9 fragments, almost all from the Kando family, that they added to their special collections. And the Museum of the Bible, of course, in Washington, D.C., purchased 14 fragments of Dead Sea Scrolls manuscripts. There was a time I think in around 2009, 2010, where we counted as many as 140 individual small fragments of manuscripts thought to be from the Dead Sea Scrolls, but were sold in private antiquities markets between 2002 and that time, so 2010, 2011, and which were not ever identified with the original site, with the original finds at Qumran or anywhere else in the Judean desert. I had the opportunity to work directly on fragments from both the Scoian collection, the collection of manuscripts belonging to Martin Scoian. He owns 32 small fragments, and the fragments belonging to the Museum of the Bible. And in the work that I did over the course of a few years, looking very closely at both of these separate private collections, I and some of my colleagues started to develop strong suspicions that these were, in fact, modern forgeries and that they were not part of the original scrolls discoveries at all. I think the remarkable thing in all this is that so many people within the field, so many people who should probably know better, I myself, for a long period of time, were duped by this. Were able to be convinced that these might, in fact, actually be authentic, genuine artifacts from
I mean, yeah, these
the
are
Dead Sea
on
Scrolls.
display from 2017 when the
Yeah.
Museum of the Bible in Washington D.C.
Yes.
opens. These fragments are on display as legitimate Dead Sea Scroll fragments.
Absolutely, yes. So, and I was part of that. I was part of that entire project. In fact,
And how do we know that they're? Oh,
so this is you can't get this anymore, by the way,
Uh-huh.
because it's been retracted on the fact that it's full of forgeries. But this is the official publication of the Dead Sea Scrolls from the Museum of the Bible collection that I co-edited
Whoa.
with Emmanuel Tove and Robert Duke. So like,
and it's got those 16 fake
14
fragments
of the
in it.
16
14
are in
of the
there.
16.
Yes.
So you've got
Yes.
the publication of the Washington
Yeah.
D.C. fragments
Yeah.
of the Dead Sea Scrolls book, and
And at the
what
time,
a piece of history. That's crazy.
right. And yeah, I've also got this one too. This is the collection of the Scoian fragments. I think you can see my name down there
Yes.
as well. But
Yeah, limited
so
signed copies are available for $5,000.
this one still is available because it's
Yeah.
not all for. There are some actual authentic Dead Sea Scrolls fragments in here. A few of the fragments, I'll just say this. Some of the first ones to be sold in the 90s to Martin Scoian were fragments that he bought from the descendants of scholars who had worked on the originals. So John Trevor and William Brownlee, some of these scholars who were part of the original team in the 1940s and the 1950s had like tiny little pieces of things like the Community Rule or the Genesis Apocryphon that had fallen off, and they just managed to keep, like, they and so they held on to for mementos. Those are the sorts of things we're confident, like, that's not a fake, that's real. They were there when this little piece flaked off, and they were able to keep it for themselves. So but those are the sorts of the first fragments that Martin Scoian purchased were these types of
And
fragments.
how
But then
much do these fragments cost? Like, say the Museum of the Bible purchases 16 fragments. I mean, I'm sure we don't know the exact numbers, but what kind of amount of money are we talking about here to buy these?
and like individual fragments, you're talking about 6 figures for an individual fragment, and these are tiny, right? Like, I mean, I'll just pull up one of these for you to give you an idea. Let's go to probably. So here, this fragment of Exodus chapter 17 measures 3.27 by 3.05 centimeters.
Wow.
Right. Like, they are
And
tiny.
hundreds of thousands of dollars for
Yes.
just one of
Yes.
these tiny
In
little
fact,
fragments.
so now some of them are a little bit bigger, right? Like some of the ones that were purchased by the Southwestern Baptist Seminary were a little bit bigger than that. So like
Man,
probably
that is
like
a lot of
like
money. Can you tell
it
us some more
is.
about how to make forged documents and how to get away with it? I'm really interested in this. In this
I'm
whole
sure you
forgery
are.
business.
Everyone
Yeah.
is. I
That is incredible.
but you know, the some of the people who made these texts were paying close attention to various features that would help them pass as authentic, right? Like, for example, there's one fragment from Scoian's collection. It's a papyrus fragment from the Book of Enoch. And after we started observing and seeing a number of scribal and textual anomalies that had convinced I and the team I was working with that these were probably forgeries. After this happened, we managed to get a number of them forensically tested by physicists in Berlin. And one of the discoveries that was made in one of these tests was of this papyrus fragment of First Enoch. They noticed under like extremely high microscope, like under what do you call that? I guess under just high magnification. There you go.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things discovered under extreme high magnification was the presence of salt crystals on the fragment, which is something that you do see on authentic fragments of the Dead Sea Scrolls, ones that haven't been cleaned and prepared for conservation and presentation, right? And I mean, this makes some sense. The area is a very highly it's a highly saline environment, right? Lots of
Mm-hmm.
salt, but uh, the appearance of naturally occurring salt crystals under magnification looks quite distinct. Some of these look like I you know the best way I can describe them are as like basalt structures or like cool crystals that wooey people like to collect, you know.
Yeah.
Now what the physicists discovered on this one fragment of Enoch was salt crystals, but these were all cubical. And then when they tested them, they discovered that they were table salt. Now, you probably don't even have to know this to understand what I'm getting at, but table salt wasn't invented until the 14th or the 15th century. It's like a modern thing. There's a whole chemical process that, you know, takes place in order to turn naturally occurring salt into table salt. And here there were not just table salt crystals scattered across the surface of this papyrus fragment, but there was ink on top of some of these pieces of table salt on the fragment. So clearly, you know, and this is the only the sort of thing that you can detect when you're working that up close to something,
Right.
too, right? So, but like that was one of the things that that we would see. Another feature that we noticed was that in particular with parchment, this happens with papyrus too, but in particular with parchment, as it ages and as it dries out, the surface layer starts to deteriorate or to flake away. And we see examples of this in the authentic Dead Sea Scrolls. You will notice if you're looking through a number of the fragments in the collection that there will be parts where the surface itself is just completely flaked off. And it's taken all the text with it. So you'll encounter bits like this on fragments. What we started to see among what I'm going to call the modern post 2002 Dead Sea Scrolls forgeries, what we started to see on a number of these were, in the first place, they're very, very poorly prepared or preserved. The surfaces are incredibly coarse, rough. Compared to the authentic Dead Sea Scrolls, they don't particularly look like prepared parchments. In actual fact, they look more just like ancient leather, maybe that you would use for other things like wineskins or shoes. So you can already tell just by looking at them that whoever's writing on these is already struggling with his surface or her surface, just to be able to write smoothly on something that's so rough. But then something else that we started to notice is that there were delaminated portions on some of these fragments, but there's writing on that too, which is, not something that would happen if this is a fragment that had been sitting out in the desert and had deteriorated over thousands of years. All that writing would have disappeared with the surface when it deteriorated, just like what we see in the authentic Dead Sea Scrolls. Now I don't even
So-
remember what your question was. Sorry.
about forgery and how we know that that these are forged. And so presumably, like, who's like the ones that you were looking at, like who was it that owned those particular fragments?
So those were the ones that I was looking at were in Martin Scoyne's private collection in Norway, and those
Yeah.
belonging to the Museum of the Bible.
Okay, so presumably you then approach these guys and you
So-
sort of say, look, you might have
Yeah.
a problem here.
I'll tell you the story here. So the team that I was working with in Norway. We approached Mr. Scoyen and we spoke to him about some of the problems with his fragments, and he's the one who gave us the permission to run all these additional tests, and we ended up publishing an article in a scholarly journal outlining the features of that we had detected indicating forgery on 9 of the fragments in Scoyen's collection. I personally think that number's higher, but these were the ones we were able to test, and these were the ones that we were able to agree on as being almost certainly forgeries. So we're working on the stuff in Scoyen's collection when I started working for the Museum of the Bible and working on their collection of Dead Sea Scrolls fragments. At the time, it was policy for everyone to sign a non-disclosure agreement whenever they gained employment working for the Museum of the Bible. And as a result of that, I was kind of sequestered and alone in my thoughts and my discussions about these fragments that they had at the Museum of the Bible. I spoke to other people who were working on them with me, but we were not allowed to talk to anybody outside of this circle. And this went on for 2 years until the time of the publication of the volume. And by this time, because I've already been looking at the stuff at the Scoyen collection and seeing the same sorts of things, I started also developing a keener eye of what to look for and how to detect forgery. And so I started to develop some very strong feelings about the problems in the Museum of the Bible fragments as well. Leading up to the publication of the volume, I was asked to write a chapter on the physical on the physical characteristics of the fragments and the paleography. So it was in that chapter I actually wrote a couple of paragraphs detailing some of my thoughts and my observations with regards to a number of the fragments, which suggested that they were probably modern forgeries. I turned it in to the other editors, and I was happy that they just published everything. as it was. And all of this kind of happened right around the same time. This has happened around the same time that we also published the article about the Scoian fragments. And of course, some of this got picked up by the Newswire. It's pretty salacious stuff, forgeries in the Dead Sea Scrolls at the Museum of the Bible, right around the time that the museum was opening as well. So it kind of became something that consumed my attention for the next several years. I continued working with the museum and helping them sort out what to do with their now complete collection of forged Dead Sea Scrolls.
Man, so were they grateful to you? Were they annoyed? Like, what was the sort of feeling? And
Yeah.
especially the guy who was like the private collector. Like, he must
Yeah,
have been pretty
so
gutted.
he was. And of course, because he doesn't have, as much money as God does, the Green family is apparently, above such concerns. But yeah, he was definitely his response. And I was appreciative of the fact that he was as forthcoming and transparent as he was in the first place when it came to pursuing this question even. What do you do if you have forgeries in your collection? What do you do as a private collector when you discover that you have forgeries in your collection? Suddenly your collection is not worth nearly as much as it was the day before, right? He had spent like real money on this material, and we were in the process of dramatically devaluing it. So there were many lengthy, painful correspondences between us and the.
Like, can you somehow, like, can you find out who forged this, where it came from? Because there must be some kind of way, at least he must know who he bought it from at the very least, Is there any way to figure out what happened there and who's to blame?
Well, this
and maybe some legal implications?
remains the open question. And it's something that this was one of the before I ran out of funding, this is what I was in the process of working on. That's one of the things I did when I was working with the Museum of the Bible, was tracking down, going through their documentation and trying to track down chains of custody, chains of ownership, just to sort of see if I could discover a source. There's another project that was underway. I think they've wrapped up now, but they were underway for 5 years in Norway, investigating not this question directly, but certainly putting together materials for gaining a more comprehensive understanding of the history of ownership of these fragments. So there's been work underway. As you can imagine, there's a lot of very sensitive legal stipulations and situations involved here, where, as much as I think I might have an idea of where these things came from, I'm just not in a position to be able to broadcast that, in large part because I don't have the evidence for it. All I have are suspicions, and until we have some concrete, clear-cut evidence which shows us where they came from, there's not much anybody can do. So it's
So
it's
they're
a
just
sensitive
out of luck, basically.
It's a sensitive situation, yeah, and they are just out of luck. So, and this is, I mean, the museum responded by the Museum of the Bible basically responded by shuttering that part of the exhibition. For a while, they had a placard on display that I helped them write about the great uncertainty of the
Mm.
authenticity of the manuscripts in the exhibit, but eventually
Fair.
the exhibit itself just ended up getting.
I suppose that is part of the risk of collecting manuscripts, is that, you know, people put a lot of money into just trying to validate these texts before they buy them. It's a whole convoluted process because, of course, like, I know more about this from like Gnostic Gospels, but the idea,
Yeah.
like with the Gospel of Judas I mentioned earlier, how, you know, Bart
Right.
Ehrman, along with a group of others, were sent by National Geographic to verify, and the owner was like, I want to give you enough that you can verify it, but I don't want to give you too much because you haven't bought it yet. And so a lot of effort has to go into very carefully making sure that you've done just enough to know that this is real. And part of the risk of that is that you might just get scammed. It's a very sort of dubious industry in that respect.
Yeah, and it's not the only reason, but it's certainly a reason why most scholars, many scholars certainly, I'd like to think most scholars are very concerned and very vocal about the sorts of problems with the private antiquities market, with private collecting of antiquities, just because I mean, in the first place, it's problematic to own cultural heritage that belongs to another people, another another group. To set monetary value on that is really problematic. But this is the sort of thing that also promotes looting and trafficking and all sorts of you know, human abuses that we don't want to participate in. Much of the antiquities market, the private antiquities market, has been deeply infected by artifacts stolen out of museums like the National Museum of Baghdad, and the funds collected through the sales of these artifacts have gone to fund ISIS and the Taliban and you know, all of these
Whoa.
groups of people that none of us want to be supporting. So it becomes an incredibly problematic situation when you're dealing with private antiquities markets, and it creates great problems for the scholars who are actually trying to do legitimate work on legitimate manuscripts, because as soon as you start introducing a fragment of a manuscript and that you don't know anything about, you don't know where it came from, you can date it using the conventional methods that you have on hand, but without the kind of um, chain of ownership that comes with a properly provenanced artifact from an actual archaeological dig. It creates issues with how we incorporate that sort of information into our broader data set of the period. It can be really frustrating for scholars and for scholarship, just trying to even sort out what to do with some of this stuff. So, but I'll get off my soapbox now. It's just these are real issues that affect real people, and certainly the scholarship as well.
Mm.
Um,
The Dead Sea Scrolls are a sort of endlessly fascinating topic in that it's not just about the content of the text, but the
Yeah.
manuscripts that they're written on, and the ink, and the materials, and the
Yeah.
dating, and the communities, and the sale, and the history, like it's everything from the iconic, famous story of their discovery by accident, somebody searching for a sheep and chucking a stone into a cave and hearing a sound. The whole story is I think plays into this feeling that people have that we're dealing with this strange and mysterious, like there's always something to discover. There's something almost mythical about the story that's told
I'll
about these
I'll tell
scrolls. It's wonderful.
I'll tell you another story that that feeds into this, right? So yeah, so you'll remember this professor of archaeology at the Hebrew University managed to purchase 3 of the manuscripts And he traveled. Like at the time, he had to go from Mount Scopus in Jerusalem, where he lived and where the university was, through. He had to get a pass and go through military checkpoints at this time of political turmoil just to get to Bethlehem to purchase these manuscripts and then get them home. It was, a risky, dangerous ordeal for him just to do this. But he tells the story in his journals, which have been published, about his adventures in doing so. He comes back to his house on Mount Scopus and runs up to his study and starts poring over these manuscripts. And this all takes place on November 29th, 1947. It's late in the evening. He's looking over a manuscript of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Horayot, this famous collection of songs and hymns. And he is keenly aware that he's the first Westerner, the first scholar to look at this stuff in over 2,000 years. And meanwhile, in the background on the radio, his son is listening to the resolution pass on the floor of the United Nations to establish and ratify the state of Israel. And he says in his journal something to the effect of how this momentous occasion was celebrated in my study, on the one event political, the other event spiritual. It's a moving moment, but it kind of helps to establish just how important this connection was, certainly in the early going, between Israel as a state, as a Jewish state, and the Dead Sea Scrolls. So, but this story doesn't end there. In the intervening years, many more scrolls are discovered. They eventually all get nationalized by the state of Israel. They all end up back in Israel, and they are, collected and preserved by the Israel Antiquities Authority, except for a number that still belong to the state of Jordan at this time, which is not, it's still outside. It's in what is properly called the West Bank. And this is how the situation was for a couple of decades, when in 1967, some 20 years later, the 6-Day War erupts in June, and Israel manages to conquer and annex all this additional territory in the West Bank, including a number of the holdings that were part of the Jordanian collection. But beyond that, after the dust settles, one of the first things that happens is that Kando, the antiquities dealer, who handled almost all of the Dead Sea Scrolls, gets a visit from agents of the Israeli government, and they enter his house and they question him, and then they come back and they confiscate from him the Temple Scroll, which is the largest of the Dead Sea Scrolls manuscripts. It was held back by Kando for a rainy day. He had his sights on, selling this someday and cashing in and having a fabulous retirement as a result of this. He held on to it for all this time. The way the story tends to be told is that the man who put these events into motion was an archaeologist and a statesman and a soldier by the name of Yigal Yadin. Now, this wasn't his given name. This was his adopted name. This is something that Jewish revolutionary fighters did during their pursuit of independence in the 1940s. Yigal Yadin actually happens to be the son of Eliezer Sukenik. He was one of the first people who knew of the existence of the Dead Sea Scrolls from his father. And he happened to be the deputy prime minister in 1967 during the Six-Day War, on the conclusion of which he had in mind that Kando had this manuscript, at least this one manuscript, if not many others, in his home in Bethlehem, which was now part of Israeli territory. So, some of these things are connected in surprising ways. And one of the things that I think we should pay close attention to is how much the narrative of the Dead Sea Scrolls, not just their ancient narrative, but their modern narrative, tends to be connected to political events, to cultural events, to religious events. I mean, it's no accident that the forgeries of the Dead Sea Scrolls that ended up on the private antiquities market were by and large purchased by very enthusiastic, conservative, evangelical Christian institutions. So, and just on that note, on that point, just to kind of reinforce what this looks like, when Azusa Pacific University purchased their 9 fragments, one of these was and these are all forgeries. One of these was a fragment containing text on 4 lines from Leviticus chapter 18 and Leviticus chapter 20. These are notorious texts for their condemnation of homosexuality. And when these fragments, when the collection was purchased, there was an interview in one of the papers with the director of the exhibit, a man by the name of Bruce McCoy. And the quotation that he gave to the newspapers was that Southwestern Seminary actually paid quite a bit of extra money for this particular fragment because, in his words, it attests to a timeless truth known from Scripture. Now, on the face of it, this is kind of silly. From an historical perspective, this is kind of silly because nobody was collecting proof texts in Roman Palestine about homosexuality. Because of course they weren't. It was a different kind of world back then. They weren't engaged in the same sorts of culture wars that we are today. But an insightful forger might have had in mind exactly what his buyers were willing to pay for. And this is what he came up with.
Man, yeah, that's quite the tale, isn't it? And yeah, I don't think it will escape people that I mean, you mentioned interdisciplinary research earlier about the actual texts themselves, but there's also an intersection of theology and history and textual criticism, which, depending on which of those angles you're coming from, there will be a different significance to the Dead Sea Scrolls. If your interest is theological, it will be, in some instances, quite reconfirming, like in the instance of the Isaiah scroll. You're going to think, wow, that's great. The story's basically the same. From a textual critical perspective, you're going to think, isn't it interesting how it's changed, or what variants there are, or what we might be able to gauge about the different authorship of Isaiah. If you're looking from a historical perspective, it's like, well, what can we learn about the people who wrote these and the things that they valued? You've spoken about how elsewhere the prevalence of certain texts among the Dead Sea Scrolls gives us an idea of their popularity at the time of the writing of the Dead Sea Scrolls, or at least the storage. So we can learn historically about the people who were reading these texts as well. And we know the influence it had because the texts which show up the most in the Dead Sea Scrolls are the ones that are most referenced in the New Testament.
Isn't that interesting, right?
And the New Testament is written sort of around the same time or just after the Dead Sea Scrolls. And so we've got this. It might not be okay, so maybe the Dead Sea Scrolls is an anomaly. Maybe they just happen to really like this Isaiah book and they don't really care about some other ones. But the fact that it comes together in that the ones that are that appear a bunch in the Dead Sea Scrolls are referenced a bunch in the New Testament, and the ones which aren't in the Dead Sea Scrolls aren't really referenced in the New Testament. We're learning a lot about the historical,
and we're not just
people
talking
as
about
well.
what, yeah, and we're not just talking about what most Protestants certainly recognize as scripture, because in addition to the texts from the Bible or from the Protestant Bible that the writers of the New Testament really liked, like Isaiah, like Genesis, like the Psalms, like Deuteronomy, they also in the New Testament quoted in the book of Jude, First Enoch, which was
Yes.
a text that was enormously popular for the writers and the collectors of the Dead Sea Scrolls. We have multiple copies of First Enoch. Some of our earliest manuscripts in the Dead Sea Scrolls are of First Enoch. We have a plethora of additional literature, which is clearly based on First Enoch in the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's just, it's just expanded as much as it's expanded our perspective and understanding of this world of ancient Judaism. It's also just brought to light how much the writers of the New Testament and the first Christians and those in the early church were a huge part of this Jewish world, and maybe in ways that are uncomfortable for some people.
Yeah. Well, if people want to dive even deeper on this, I mean, we've been speaking for the better part of 2.5 hours now, but there are more and more hours if you wish to find them on your YouTube channel, Kip, which of course is linked in the description. You've got a whole series on the Dead Sea Scrolls and its history and its discovery, but all kinds of streams and videos and series and interviews and all kinds of stuff to be found on your channel. So if people are interested, they know where to go. Kip Davis, thank you so much for taking the time. It's been a long time coming that I would do a
Yes.
video on the Dead Sea Scrolls, and we managed to get through the whole of it without mentioning any recent scandals involving this ancient text. So I think we've done a pretty good
How
job.
about that?
Yeah,
Awesome.
What do you know?
Thanks.
So thanks again. Thanks for coming on, man.
Thank you for having me, Alex. It's been my pleasure.